Good evening. This is a compilation video of stories from the classic masters such as Algernon Blackwood that feature haunted houses. These videos are available elsewhere on this very channel if you want to listen to them without the rain noise. The purpose of these stories here is for you to fall asleep, so it's intended as a sleep aid. If you want to listen to them with full attention, I would recommend you find the stories on the Classic Ghost Stories podcast channel that don't have the rain. If you are wanting to fall asleep, please continue. And of course, at the end, you can just play it all again. Have a good night's sleep. I hope you drift off soon. The empty house. Certain houses, like certain persons, manage somehow to proclaim at once their character for evil. In the case of the latter, no particular feature need betray them. They may boast an open countenance and an ingenuous smile, and yet a little of their company leaves the unalterable conviction that there is something radically amiss with their being, that they are evil. Willy-nilly they seem to communicate an atmosphere of secret and wicked thoughts, which makes those in their immediate neighbourhood shrink from them, as from a thing diseased. And perhaps with houses, the same principle is operative, and it is the aroma of evil deeds committed under a particular roof, long after the actual doers have passed away, that makes the gooseflesh come and the hair rise. Something of the original passion of the evildoer and of the horror felt by his victim enters the heart of the innocent watcher, and he becomes suddenly conscious of tingling nerves, creeping skin, and a chilling of the blood. He is terror-stricken without apparent cause. There was manifestly nothing in the external appearance of this particular house to bear out the tales of the horror that was said to reign within. It was neither lonely nor unkempt. It stood crowded into a corner of the square and looked exactly like the houses on either side of it. It had the same number of windows as its neighbours, the same balcony overlooking the gardens, the same white steps leading up to the heavy black front door, and in the rear there was the same narrow strip of green with neat box borders running up to the wall that divided it from the backs of the adjoining houses. Apparently, too, the number of chimney pots on the roof was the same, the breadth and angle of the eaves, and even the height of the dirty area railings. And yet this house in the square, that seemed precisely similar to its 50 ugly neighbours, was, as a matter of fact, entirely different. Horribly different. Wherein lay this marked, invisible difference is impossible to say. It cannot be ascribed wholly to the imagination, because persons who had spent some time in the house, knowing nothing of the facts, had declared positively that certain rooms were so disagreeable they would rather die than enter them again, and that the atmosphere of the whole house produced in them symptoms of a genuine terror, while the series of innocent tenants who had tried to live in it and been forced to decamp at the shortest possible notice was indeed little less than a scandal in the town. When Shorthouse arrived to pay a weekend visit to his Aunt Julia in her little house on the seafront at the other end of the town, he found her charged to the brim with mystery and excitement. He had only received her telegram that morning, and he had come anticipating boredom, but the moment he touched her hand and kissed her apple-skin wrinkled cheek, he caught the first wave of her electrical condition. The impression deepened when he learned that there were to be no other visitors, and that he had been telegraphed for with a very special object. Something was in the wind, and the something would doubtless bear fruit, for this elderly spinster aunt with a mania for psychical research had brains as well as willpower, and by hook or by crook, she usually managed to accomplish her ends. The revelation was made soon after tea, when she sidled close up to him as they paced slowly along the seafront in the dusk. "I've got the keys," she announced in a delighted yet half-awesome voice. Got them till Monday. The keys of the bathing machine, or? He asked innocently, looking from the sea to the town. Nothing brought her so quickly to the point as feigning stupidity. Neither, she whispered. I've got the keys of the haunted house in the square, and I'm going there tonight. Shorthouse was conscious of the slightest possible tremor down his back. He dropped his teasing tone. Something in her voice and manner thrilled him. She was in earnest. But you can't go alone, he began. That's why I wired for you, she said with decision. He turned to look at her. The ugly, lined, enigmatical face was alive with excitement. There was the glow of genuine enthusiasm round it like a halo. The eyes shone. He caught another wave of her excitement, and a second tremor, more marked than the first, accompanied it. Thanks, Aunt Julie, he said politely. Thanks awfully. I shouldn't dare to go quite alone, she went on, raising her voice, but with you, I should enjoy it immensely. You're afraid of nothing, I know. Thanks so much, he said again. Is anything likely to happen? A great deal has happened, she whispered, though it's been most cleverly hushed up. 3 tenants have come and gone in the last few months, and the house is said to be empty for good now. In spite of himself, Shorthouse became interested. His aunt was so very much in earnest. The house is very old indeed, she went on, and the story, an unpleasant one, dates a long way back. It has to do with a murder committed by a jealous stableman who had some affair with a servant in the house. One night, he managed to secrete himself in the cellar, and when everyone was asleep, he crept upstairs to the servants' quarters, chased the girl down to the next landing, and before anyone could come to the rescue, threw her bodily over the banisters into the hall below. And the stableman was caught, I believe, and hanged for murder. But it all happened a century ago, and I've not been able to get more details of the story. Shorthouse now felt his interest thoroughly aroused, but though he was not particularly nervous for himself, he hesitated a little on his aunt's account. On one condition, he said at length. Nothing will prevent me going, she said firmly, but I may as well hear your condition, that you guarantee your power of self-control if anything really horrible happens. I mean, that you're sure you won't get too frightened. Jim, she said scornfully, I'm not young, I know, nor are my nerves, but with you, I should be afraid of nothing in the world. This, of course, settled it, for Shorthouse had no pretensions to being other than a very ordinary young man, and an appeal to his vanity was irresistible. He agreed to go. Instinctively, by a sort of subconscious preparation, he kept himself and his forces well in hand the whole evening, compelling an accumulative reserve of control by that nameless inward process of gradually putting all the emotions away and turning the key upon them. A process difficult to describe, but wonderfully effective, as all men who have lived through severe trials of the inner man well understand. Later, it stood him in good stead. But it was not until 10:30, when they stood in the hall, well in the glare of friendly lamps and still surrounded by comforting human influences, that he had to make the first call upon this store of collected strength. For once the door was closed, and he saw the deserted, silent street stretching away white in the moonlight before them, it came to him clearly that the real test that night would be in dealing with 2 fears instead of 1. He would have to carry his aunt's fear as well as his own, and as he glanced down at her sphinx-like countenance and realized that it might assume no pleasant aspect in a rush of real terror, he felt satisfied with only one thing in the whole adventure, that he had confidence in his own will and power to stand against any shock that might come. Slowly, they walked along the empty streets of the town. A bright autumn moon silvered the roofs, casting deep shadows. There was no breath of wind, and the trees in the formal gardens by the seafront watched them silently as they passed along. To his aunt's occasional remarks, Shorthouse made no reply, realizing that she was simply surrounding herself with mental buffers, saying ordinary things to prevent herself thinking of extraordinary things. Few windows showed lights, and from scarcely a single chimney came smoke or sparks. Shorthouse had already begun to notice everything, even the smallest details. Presently they stopped at the street corner and looked up at the name on the side of the house full in the moonlight, and with one accord, but without remark, turned into the square, and crossed over to the side of it that lay in shadow. "The number of the house is 13, whispered a voice at his side. And neither of them made the obvious reference but passed along the broad sheet of moonlight and began to march up the pavement in silence. It was about halfway up the square that Shorthouse felt an arm slipped quietly but significantly into his own, and knew then that their adventure had begun in earnest, and that his companion was already yielding imperceptibly to the influences against them. She needed support. A few minutes later, they stopped before a tall, narrow house that rose before them into the night, ugly in shape and painted a dingy white. Shutterless windows without blinds stared down upon them, shining here and there in the moonlight. There were weather streaks in the wall and cracks in the paint, and the balcony bulged out from the first floor a little unnaturally. But beyond this generally forlorn appearance of an unoccupied house, there was nothing at first sight to single out this particular mansion for the evil character it had most certainly acquired. Taking a look over their shoulders to make sure they had not been followed, they went boldly up the steps and stood against the huge black door that fronted them forbiddingly. But the first wave of nervousness was now upon them, and Shorthouse fumbled a long time with the key before he could fit it into the lock at all. For a moment, if truth be told, they both hoped it would not open, for they were a prey to various unpleasant emotions as they stood there on the threshold of their ghostly adventure. Shorthouse, shuffling with the key and hampered by the steady weight on his arm, certainly felt the solemnity of the moment. It was as if the whole world, for all experience, seemed at that instant concentrated in his own consciousness, were listening to the grating noise of that key. A stray puff of wind wandering down the empty street woke a momentary rustling in the trees behind them, but otherwise, this rattling of the key was the only sound audible. And at last it turned in the lock, and the heavy door swung open and revealed a yawning gulf of darkness beyond. With a last glance at the moonlit square, they passed quickly in, and the door slammed behind them with a roar that echoed prodigiously through empty halls and passages. But instantly, with the echoes, another sound made itself heard, and Aunt Julia leaned suddenly so heavily upon him that he had to take a step backwards to save himself from falling. A man had coughed close beside them, so close that it seemed they must have actually been by his side in the darkness. With the possibility of practical jokes in his mind, Shorthouse at once swung his heavy stick in the direction of the sound, but it met nothing more solid than air. He heard his aunt give a little gasp beside him. "Someone here," she whispered. "I heard him." "Be quiet," he said sternly. It was nothing but the noise of the front door. "Oh, get a light, quick," she added, as her nephew, fumbling with the box of matches, opened it upside down and let them all fall with a rattle onto the stone floor. The sound, however, was not repeated, and there was no evidence of retreating footsteps. In another minute they had a candle burning, using an empty end of a cigar case as a holder, and when the first flare had died down, he held the impromptu lamp aloft and surveyed the scene. And it was dreary enough in all conscience, for there is nothing more desolate in all the abodes of men than an unfurnished house dimly lit, silent and forsaken, and yet tenanted by rumour with the memories of evil and violent histories. They were standing in a wide hallway. On their left was the open door of a spacious dining room, and in front the hall ran, ever narrowing, into a long, dark passage that led apparently to the top of the kitchen stairs. The broad, uncarpeted staircase rose in a sweep before them, everywhere draped in shadows, except for a single spot about halfway up, where the moonlight came in through the window and fell in a bright patch on the boards. This shaft of light shed a faint radiance above and below it, lending to the objects within its reach a misty outline that was infinitely more suggestive and ghostly than complete darkness. The filtered moonlight always seems to paint faces on the surrounding gloom, and the Shorthouse peered up into the well of darkness and thought of the countless empty rooms and passages in the upper part of the old house. He caught himself longing again for the safety of the moonlit square, or the cosy, bright drawing room they had left an hour before. Then, realizing that these thoughts were dangerous, he thrust them away again and summoned all his energy for concentration on the present. "Aunt Julia," he said aloud severely, "we must go now through the house from top to bottom and make a thorough search." The echoes of his voice died away slowly all over the building, and in the intense silence that followed, he turned to look at her. In the candlelight, he saw that her face was already ghastly pale, but she dropped his arm for a moment and said in a whisper, stepping close in front of him, "I agree, we must be sure there's no one hiding. That's the first thing." She spoke with evident effort, and he looked at her with admiration. "You feel quite sure of yourself? It's not too late." I think so," she whispered, her eyes shifting nervously towards the shadows behind. "Quite sure. Only one thing." "What's that?" "You must never leave me alone for an instant. As long as you understand that any sound or appearance must be investigated at once, for to hesitate means to admit fear. That is fatal." "Agreed," she said a little shakily after a moment's hesitation. "I'll try." Arm in arm, Shorthouse holding the dripping candle and the stick, while his aunt carried the cloak over her shoulders, figures of utter comedy to all but themselves, they began a systematic search. Stealthily walking on tiptoe and shading the candle lest it should betray their presence through the shutterless windows, they went first into the big dining room. There was not a stick of furniture to be seen. Bare walls, ugly mantelpieces and empty grates stared at them. Everything, they felt, resented their intrusion, watching them, as it were, with veiled eyes. Whispers followed them. Shadows flitted noiselessly to right and left. Something seemed ever at their back, watching, waiting an opportunity to do them injury. There was the inevitable sense that operations which went on when the room was empty had been temporarily suspended till they were well out of the way again. The whole dark interior of the old building seemed to become a malignant presence that rose up, warning them to desist and mind their own business. Every moment the strain on their nerves increased. Out of the gloomy dining room they passed through large folding doors into a sort of library or smoking room, wrapped equally in silence, darkness and dust, and from this they regained the hall near the top of the back stairs. Here a pitch-black tunnel opened before them into the lower regions, and, it must be confessed, they hesitated, but only for a minute. With the worst of the night still to come, it was essential to turn from nothing. Aunt Julia stumbled at the top step of the dark descent, ill-lit by the flickering candle, and even Shorthouse felt at least half the decision go out of his legs. "Come on," he said peremptorily, and his voice ran on and lost itself in the dark, empty spaces below. I'm coming," she faltered, catching his arm with unnecessary violence. They went a little unsteadily down the stone steps, a cold, damp air meeting them in the face, close and malodorous. The kitchen, into which the stairs led along a narrow passage, was large, with a lofty ceiling. Several doors opened out of it, some into cupboards with empty jars still standing on the shelves, and others into horrible little ghostly back offices, each colder and less inviting than the last. Black beetles scurried over the floor, and once, when they knocked against a deal table standing in a corner, something about the size of a cat jumped down with a rush and fled, scampering across the stone floor into the darkness. Everywhere there was a sense of recent occupation, an impression of sadness and gloom. Leaving the main kitchen, they next went towards the scullery. The door was standing ajar, and as they pushed it open to its full extent, Aunt Julia uttered a piercing scream, which she instantly tried to stifle by placing her hand over her mouth. For a second, Shorthouse stood stock still, catching his breath. He felt as if his spine had suddenly become hollow, and someone had filled it with particles of ice. Facing them, directly in the way between the doorposts, stood the figure of a woman. She had dishevelled hair and wildly staring eyes, and her face was terrified and white as death. She stood there motionless for the space of a single second. Then the candle flickered, and she was gone. Gone utterly, and the door framed nothing but empty darkness. "Only the beastly jumping candlelight," he said quickly in a voice that sounded like someone else's and was only half under control. "Come on, Aunt, there's nothing there." He dragged her forward. With a clattering of feet and a great appearance of boldness, they went on, but over his body the skin moved as if crawling ants covered it, and he knew by the weight on his arm that he was supplying the force of locomotion for two. The scullery was cold, bare and empty, more like a large prison cell than anything else. They went around it, tried the door into the yard and the windows, but found them all fastened securely. His aunt moved beside him like a person in a dream. Her eyes were tightly shut, and she seemed merely to follow the pressure of his arm. Her courage filled him with amazement. At the same time, he noticed that a certain odd change had come over her face, a change which somehow evaded his power of analysis. "There's nothing here, Auntie," he repeated aloud quickly. "Let's go upstairs and see the rest of the house. Then we'll choose a room to wait up in." She followed him obediently, keeping close to his side, and they locked the kitchen door behind them. It was a relief to get up again. In the hall there was more light than before, for the moon had travelled a little further down the stairs. Cautiously, they began to go up into the dark vault of the upper house, the boards creaking under their weight. On the first floor, they found the large double drawing rooms, a search of which revealed nothing. Here also was no sign of furniture or recent occupancy, nothing but dust and neglect and shadows. They opened the big folding doors between front and back drawing rooms and then came out again to the landing and went on upstairs. They had not gone up more than a dozen steps when they both simultaneously stopped to listen, looking into each other's eyes with a new apprehension across the flickering candle flame. From the room they had left hardly 10 seconds before came the sound of doors quietly closing. It was beyond all question. They heard the booming noise that accompanies the shutting of heavy doors, followed by the sharp catching of the latch. "We must go back and see," said Shorthouse briefly in a low tone, and turned to go downstairs again. Somehow she managed to drag after him, her feet catching in her dress, her face livid. When they entered the front drawing room, it was plain that the folding doors had been closed half a minute before. Without hesitation, Shorthouse opened them. He almost expected to see someone facing him in the back room, but only darkness and cold air met him. They went through both rooms, finding nothing unusual. They tried in every way to make the doors close of themselves, but there was not wind enough to even set the candle flame flickering. The doors would not move without strong pressure. All was silent as the grave. Undeniably, the rooms were utterly empty, and the house utterly still. "It's beginning," whispered a voice at his elbow which he hardly recognized as his aunt's. He nodded acquiescence, taking out his watch to note the time. It was 15 minutes before midnight. He made the entry of exactly what had occurred in his notebook, setting the candle in its case upon the floor in order to do so. It took a moment or two to balance it safely against the wall. Aunt Julia always declared that at this moment she was not actually watching him, but had turned her head towards the inner room, where she fancied she heard something moving. But at any rate, both positively agreed that there came the sound of rushing feet, heavy and very swift, and the next instant the candle was out. But to Shorthouse himself had come more than this, and he has always thanked his fortunate stars that it came to him alone and not to his aunt too. For, as he rose from the stooping position of balancing the candle, and before it was actually extinguished, a face thrust itself forward, so close to his own that he could almost have touched it with his lips. It was a face working with passion, a man's face, dark, with thick features and angry, savage eyes. It belonged to a common man, and it was evil in its ordinary, normal expression, no doubt. But as he saw it, alive with intense, aggressive emotion, it was a malignant and terrible human countenance. There was no movement of the air, nothing but the sound of rushing feet, stockinged or muffled feet. the apparition of the face and the almost simultaneous extinguishing of the candle. In spite of himself, Shorthouse uttered a little cry, nearly losing his balance as his aunt clung to him with her whole weight in one moment of real, uncontrollable terror. She made no sound, but simply seized him bodily. Fortunately, however, she had seen nothing, but had only heard the rushing feet, for her control returned almost at once, and he was able to disentangle himself and strike a match. The shadows ran away on all sides before the glare, and his aunt stooped down and groped for the cigar case with the precious candle. Then they discovered that the candle had not been blown out at all. It had been crushed out. The wick was pressed down into the wax, which was flattened as if by some smooth, heavy instrument. How his companion so quickly overcame her terror, Shorthouse never properly understood. But his admiration for her self-control increased tenfold, and at the same time served to feed his own dying flame, for which he was undeniably grateful. Equally inexplicable to him was the evidence of physical force they had just witnessed. He at once suppressed the memory of stories he had heard of physical mediums and their dangerous phenomena, for if these were true, and either his aunt or himself was unwittingly a physical medium, it meant that they were simply aiding to focus the forces of a haunted house already charged to the brim. It was like walking with unprotected lamps among uncovered stores of gunpowder. So, with as little reflection as possible, he simply relit the candle and went on up to the next floor. The arm in his trembled, it is true, and his own tread was often uncertain. But they went on with thoroughness, and after a search revealing nothing, they climbed the last flight of stairs to the top floor of all. Here, they found a perfect nest of small servants' rooms with broken pieces of furniture, dirty cane-bottomed chairs, chests of drawers, cracked mirrors, and decrepit bedsteads. The rooms had low sloping ceilings already hung here and there with cobwebs, small windows, and badly plastered walls, a depressing and dismal region which they were glad to leave behind. It was on the stroke of midnight when they entered a small room on the third floor, close to the top of the stairs, and arranged to make themselves comfortable for the remainder of their adventure. It was absolutely bare, and was said to be the room then used as a clothes closet into which the infuriated groom had chased his victim and finally caught her. Outside, across the narrow landing, began the stairs leading up to the floor above, and the servants' quarters where they had just searched. In spite of the chilliness of the night, there was something in the air of this room that cried for an open window. But there was more than this. Shorthouse could only describe it by saying that he felt less master of himself here than in any other part of the house. There was something that acted directly on the nerves, tiring the resolution, enfeebling the will. He was conscious of this result before he had been in the room 5 minutes, and it was in the short time they stayed there that he suffered the wholesale depletion of his vital forces, which was, for himself, the chief horror of the whole experience. They put the candle on the floor of the cupboard, leaving the door a few inches ajar, so that there was no glare to confuse the eyes, and no shadow to shift about on walls and ceiling. Then they spread the cloak on the floor and sat down to wait, with their backs against the wall. Shorthouse was within 2 feet of the door to the landing. His position commanded a good view of the main staircase leading down into the darkness, and also of the beginning of the servants' stairs going to the floor above. The heavy stick lay beside him within easy reach. The moon was now high above the house. Through the open window they could see the comforting stars like friendly eyes watching in the sky. One by one, the clocks of the town struck midnight, and when the sounds died away, the deep silence of a windless night fell again over everything. Only the boom of the sea, far away and lugubrious, filled the air with hollow murmurs. Inside the house, the silence became awful. Awful, he thought, because any minute now it might be broken by sounds portending terror. The strain of waiting told more and more severely on the nerves. They talked in whispers when they talked at all, for their voices aloud sounded queer and unnatural. A chilliness not altogether due to the night air, invaded the room and made them cold. The influences against them, whatever these might be, were slowly robbing them of self-confidence and the power of decisive action. Their forces were on the wane, and the possibility of real fear took on a new and terrible meaning. He began to tremble for the elderly woman by his side, whose pluck could hardly save her beyond a certain extent. He heard the blood singing in his veins. It sometimes seemed so loud that he fancied it prevented his hearing properly certain other sounds that were beginning, very faintly, to make themselves audible in the depths of the house. Every time he fastened his attention on these sounds, they instantly ceased. They certainly came no nearer, yet he could not rid himself of the idea that movement was going on somewhere in the lower regions of the house. The drawing-room floor, where the doors had been so strangely closed, seemed too near. The sounds were further off than that. He thought of the great kitchen with the scurrying black beetles and of the dismal little scullery, but somehow or other they did not seem to come from there either. Surely they were not outside the house. Then suddenly the truth flashed into his mind, and for the space of a minute he felt as if his blood had stopped flowing and turned to ice. The sounds were not downstairs at all. They were upstairs. Upstairs, somewhere among those horrid, gloomy little servants' rooms, with their bits of broken furniture, low ceilings and cramped windows. Upstairs, where the victim had first been disturbed and stalked to her death. And the moment he discovered where the sounds were, he began to hear them more clearly. It was the sound of feet moving stealthily along the passage overhead, in and out among the rooms and past the furniture. He turned quickly to steal a glance at the motionless figure seated beside him to note whether she had shared his discovery. The faint candlelight coming through the crack in the cupboard door threw her strongly marked face into vivid relief against the white of the wall. But it was something else that made him catch his breath and stare again. An extraordinary something had come into her face and seemed to spread over her features like a mask. It smoothed out the deep lines and drew the skin everywhere a little tighter, so that the wrinkles disappeared. It brought into the face, with the sole exception of the old eyes, an appearance of youth and almost of childhood. He stared in speechless amazement that was dangerously near to horror. It was his aunt's face indeed, but it was her face of 40 years ago, the vacant, innocent face of a girl. He had heard stories of that strange effect of terror which could wipe a human countenance clean of other emotions, obliterating all previous expressions, but he had never realized that it could be literally true, or could mean anything so simply horrible as what he now saw. For the dreadful signature of overmastering fear was written plainly in that utter vacancy of the girlish face beside him, and when, feeling his intense gaze, she turned to look at him, he instinctively closed his eyes tightly to shut out the sight. Yet, when he turned a minute later, his feelings well in hand, he saw to his intense relief another expression. His aunt was smiling, and though the face was deathly white, the awful veil had lifted, and the normal look was returning. "Anything wrong?" was all he could think of to say at the moment, and the answer was eloquent coming from such a woman. "I feel cold and a little frightened," she whispered. He offered to close the window, but she seized hold of him and begged him not to leave her side even for an instant. "It's upstairs, I know," she whispered with an odd half-laugh, "but I can't possibly go up." But Shorthouse thought otherwise, knowing that in action lay their best hope of self-control. He took the brandy flask and poured out a glass of neat spirit stiff enough to help anybody over anything. She swallowed it with a little shiver. His only idea now was to get out of the house before her collapse became inevitable, but this could not safely be done by turning tail and running from the enemy. Inaction was no longer possible. Every minute he was growing less master of himself, and desperate, aggressive measures were imperative without further delay. Moreover, the action must be taken towards the enemy, not away from it. The climax, if necessary and unavoidable, would have to be faced boldly. He could do it now, but in 10 minutes he might not have the force left to act for himself, much less for both. Upstairs, the sounds were meanwhile becoming louder and closer, accompanied by occasional creaking of the boards. Someone was moving stealthily about, stumbling now and then awkwardly against the furniture. Waiting a few moments to allow the tremendous dose of spirits to produce its effect, and knowing this would last but a short time under the circumstances, Shorthouse then quietly got to his feet, saying in a determined voice, "Now, Aunt Julia, we'll go upstairs and find out what all this noise is. You must come too. It's what we agreed." He picked up his stick and went to the cupboard for the candle. A limp form rose shakily beside him, breathing hard, and he heard a voice say very faintly something about being ready to come. The woman's courage amazed him. It was so much greater than his own, and as they advanced, holding aloft the dripping candle, some subtle force exhaled from this trembling, white-faced old woman at his side that was the true source of his inspiration. It held something really great that shamed him and gave him the support without which he would have proved far less equal to the occasion. They crossed the dark landing, avoiding with their eyes the deep black space over the banisters. Then they began to mount the narrow staircase to meet the sounds which, minute by minute, grew louder and nearer. About halfway up the stairs, Aunt Julia stumbled, and Shorthouse turned to catch her by the arm, and just at that moment there came a terrific crash in the servants' corridor overhead. It was instantly followed by a shrill, agonized scream that was a cry of terror and a cry for help melted into one. Before they could move aside or go down a single step, someone came rushing along the passage overhead, blundering horribly, racing madly at full speed, 3 steps at a time, down the very staircase where they stood. The steps were light and uncertain, but close behind them sounded the heavier tread of another person, and the staircase seemed to shake. Shorthouse and his companion just had time to flatten themselves against the wall when the jumble of flying steps was upon them, and 2 persons, with the slightest possible interval between them, dashed past at full speed. It was a perfect whirlwind of sound breaking in upon the midnight silence of the empty building. The 2 runners, pursuer and pursued, had passed clean through them where they stood, and already, with the thunderbolts below, had received first one, then the other. Yet they had seen absolutely nothing, not a hand or arm or face, or even a shred of flying clothing. There came a second's pause. Then the first one, the lighter of the 2, obviously the pursued one, ran with uncertain footsteps into the little room where Shorthouse and his aunt had just left. The heavier one followed. There was a sound of scuffling, gasping and smothered screaming, and then, out onto the landing, came the step of a single person, treading weightily. A dead silence followed for the space of half a minute, and then was heard a rushing sound through the air. It was followed by a dull crashing thud in the depths of the house below, on the stone floor of the hall. Utter silence reigned after. Nothing moved. The flame of the candle was steady. It had been steady the whole time, and the air had been undisturbed by any movement whatsoever. Palsied with terror, Aunt Julia, without waiting for her companion, began fumbling her way downstairs. She was crying gently to herself, and when Shorthouse put his arm around her and half carried her, he felt that she was trembling like a leaf. He went into the little room and picked up the cloak from the floor, and arm in arm, walking very slowly, without speaking a word or looking once behind them, they marched down the 3 flights into the hall. In the hall they saw nothing, but the whole way down the stairs they were conscious that someone followed them, step by step. When they went faster, it was left behind, and when they went more slowly, it caught them up. But never once did they look behind to see, and at each turning of the staircase, They lowered their eyes for fear of the following horror they might see upon the stairs above. With trembling hands, Shorthouse opened the front door, and they walked out into the moonlight and drew a deep breath of the cool night air blowing in from the sea. Lodges by Joan Aiken. Are you sure, Doctor? Said Rose Burdock. You really mean that he's got mumps and she's got measles? You couldn't be mistaken? No mistake, said Dr. Cobb briskly. Seen too many cases this week. Half the town's got one or the other. Bob's got the stiff neck, Titch has the spots. Nothing you can do but keep 'em warm, give 'em aspirin and lots to drink. Wrap up their necks and ears and keep them isolated, because what's sure to happen is that in a couple of weeks they'll swap bugs. It's then you really have to worry, because they'll be a bit pulled down by the first bug, so they may take the next one harder. How long will it last? She said faintly. He was scribbling prescriptions. You'll probably have 'em both at home for about a month from first to last. Here, this is for Titch. Every 4 hours around the clock, and these are for Bob, same, till their temperatures are back to normal. Call me if the fever goes on for more than 2 days, or if there is any delirium. Delirium? Not likely, unless mumps meningitis sets in. Watch out for bronchitis or pneumonia, though, of course. Have you had mumps and measles, by the way? Oh, yes. Well, you can get mumps again, so look out, he said with callous cheer, running down the front steps. Rose dully watched him go. There was a small disused graveyard beside her house. A heavy rain followed by a sharp January frost had left all the gravestones neatly cased in ice. They looked like playing cards laid out for patience. Patience. How peaceful, she thought, to be lying stretched out in one's bones under there with an ice pack overhead, and went back into the house where Titch, hot and miserable, wanted a drink and to be rubbed with eau de cologne. Bob, feverish and with acutely painful glands, wanted a hot poultice round his neck to take away the pain. Both asked to be read aloud to, and both wished to be made instantly better. Rose presently dragged herself wearily downstairs for the next disagreeable duty. A woman seen. Can I speak to Mrs. Joubert, please? Mrs. Joubert, this is Rose Burdock. Mrs. Joubert, I am most terribly sorry, but it looks as if I shan't be able to get into the office on Monday. Both my children are sick, one with mumps, other with measles, and my lodger left 2 days ago. I've got no one at home to look after them. Yes, of course I will. But yes, I know. Yes, I do realise that. Yes, I know Wednesday is press day. I'll certainly see what I can do. I just thought I'd better warn you in case. Yes, I will. Yes, of course. You do remember, Mrs. Burdock, came the editor's clear voice over the wire, that when we gave you this job, it was on the strict understanding that there were to be no extra days off, no emergencies or crises, that if you came to us, you promised never to leave us in a lurch on press days. Rose remembered the conversation extremely well. Mrs. Joubert, who had a face like an isosceles triangle on its apex, with a crest of blue hair and 2 zero signs for eyes, had terrified her so much that she had made the promise unhesitatingly with every intention of keeping it. Besides, with a well-disposed lodger who was always at home at tea time before the children had finished school, the future seemed secure. Who could have foretold that the lodger would be summoned to Scotland to nurse a dying mother, or that the children would succumb to mumps and measles simultaneously? "I'll do my very best, Mrs. Joubert," she said in despair. "Please do, dear, because this sort of thing really mustn't happen, you know. We've been very good to you, made special arrangements for you to work a 4-day week." "Yes, I know. Very well, then." After the formidable click with which Mrs. Joubert rang off came the immediate peal of the front door. "Oh, God, now what?" Rose thought, and dragged herself to the door. If that's the meter, it means another electricity bill. It was not the meter man, but a frail-looking woman with badly waved hair dangling on either side of her face like a cocker spaniel's ears. Her face was somehow ineffectual, pale and long, with anxious grey eyes and a mouth that made efforts to be firm, but kept dropping back into a weakly placating curve. Her skin was dry and chalky, and her clothes hung on her like dead leaves after the first rains of winter. "Mrs. Burdock?" Her voice was placating too, refined yet shallow, as if she never took in quite enough breath. "You won't know me, but I've heard of you through your professional associates. Well, through Mrs. Joubert, actually." "If it's life insurance, I'm afraid I'm not interested," said Rose swiftly. "And you must excuse me, but I've got 2 sick children in the house. I have to get back to them." No, you misunderstand me. I'm giving Mrs. Joubert as a reference. Actually, she's a friend of my husband's father, Admiral Colgate at South Dean." "Oh, I see." In fact, Rose saw nothing. It was true that Mrs. Joubert had a weekend cottage at the village of South Dean 5 miles away, and no doubt she knew dozens of admirals there. But why should that bring this dithering woman to stand on her threshold? "The fact is, we're a bit desperate, my husband and I," Mrs. Colgate went on rapidly, with what she seemed to hope was a winning smile. "And we happened to hear, through the local grapevine, you know, that you might have some rooms to let in your house. We wondered if there might be a chance for us to rent them." "You want to rent rooms?" Suddenly, the sunlight on the graveyard's frosted grass seemed to have acquired the heat of midsummer. Mrs. Colgate's chalky face was haloed in a golden fuzz of hair. Oh, now I do see. Please come in and look at them, won't you? I'm afraid they're nothing very grand, just 2 rooms, a bathroom and kitchenette. Won't you come upstairs?" "We don't want anything grand," pattered Mrs. Colgate in a soft, conciliating voice, following up the stairs. She had to duck her skimpy length to get in at the spare bedroom door, for the house was Tudor, with lintels to match, and she quite tall. Nonetheless, she instantly exclaimed, "Oh, how delightful! Why, this would suit us down to the ground. It's really an answer to a prayer, you see, as my husband has been disqualified for driving for 6 months, just on a technicality, you know, so silly. And he has to catch the 8:15 twice a week to town. And there's no bus to South Dean, and I'm a wretched driver in a fog, and you know how many fogs we've been having these mornings. We have been living at South Dean with the Admiral. You see, my husband's father, ever since we had to come back from Iran so suddenly, Desmond had an excellent job in Tehran. It was so sad when things got difficult there." All this flowed out in a gentle, unaccented stream as she, rather inattentively it seemed to Rose, inspected the bathroom, kitchenette, and 2 bed-sitting rooms. "Quite perfect. And is there a shed or something where we can garage the car?" That, Rose was obliged to confess, that there was not. Her own Minnie lived across the lane, where there was a slot just big enough for 1 car. But I'm afraid they won't allow any more. You can park overnight in the main square, though. That's only 3 minutes' walk. Mrs. Colgate declared that would be absolutely super, and that the whole thing was just what they'd been looking for. "Only 3 minutes to the bus, too. Couldn't be more convenient. May we move in this afternoon?" "Don't you want your husband to come and look first?" said Rose, a little startled. Oh, no need. No need at all. He'll love it just as much as I do. There's just one thing. Rose hesitated, feeling that heaven sent though this chance seemed, it behoved her to be honest. I have two children, aged 6 and 8. Oh, the pets! We love children, cried Mrs. Colgate. I've had children of my own, you see, grown now, alas. We shall be so happy to live in a house with children once more. Oh, that's, I'm very sorry. But the thing is, went on Rose desperately, that one of my children has mumps at present, and the other has measles. And in about 10 days' time, or even sooner, they are due to reverse the pattern. Are you sure you want to place that? Have you had mumps or measles yourself, Mrs. Colgate? Bless you, yes, my dear, long ago, and so has my husband. Mumps and measles are nothing to us. We shall be happy to nurse your children for you. It will make us feel needed. I gather you go up to town every day. I feel quite certain that we're going to fit into your house very well. That's all settled then, and we'll move in this afternoon between 3 and 4, if that's a good time. Yes, of course, Rose said. I'll give you some keys. Mrs. Colgate's smile had been so continuous and persevering that it was rather a shock for Rose to observe the violent shaking of her hands as she received the keys. Poor thing. Perhaps she had arthritis, or Parkinson's disease, was it, that made her hands shake, or somebody's palsy? Who was that at the door? Called the children's voices from their separate bedrooms. It was no use putting them in together. First they argued, then they quarrelled, finally they fought. Rose went to tell them that the 2 new lodgers were due to arrive, who would be happy to read aloud, fetch drinks, and do shopping errands. Bob took the news indifferently. He had a temperature of 102. Titch's face fell. I thought you'd stay at home and look after us, she said dolefully. Honey, you know I'd like to, but I can't. I have to go to my office. But I'm sure Mr. and Mrs. Colgate will be very nice. At 2:30, the bell rang again. And it was a short, very fat man with a green eye shade over his face, who had an immense untidy bundle wrapped in a red baize cloth. Mrs. Burdock, I'm Desmond Colgate. Delighted to meet you. Can't shake hands. May I carry this little lot upstairs? His voice was startlingly high and shrill. The only thing higher, Rose thought, would be a bat's squeak. What she could see of his face, below the green shade, was almost as startlingly white and moist, like the underside of a plaice. Taking her silence for assent, he nipped past her, and locating the stairs by instinct, it seemed, went quickly up with his load. Finding her wits, Rose followed and directed him into the lodgers' rooms. Delightful, delightful, he said, dumping the cloth-wrapped bundle on the bed and crossing to the window. I'm sorry it looks out on the graveyard, Rose said, after clearing her throat. My son's room does too. I do hope you don't mind. Mind? Why should I mind? Oh, he said, chuckling. Do you mean worry about the spirits of the departed, that sort of thing? But, my dear young lady, that little graveyard is old. Why, I dare say no one has been buried in it for 100 years. Nothing spooky is going to come out of there. Dear me, no. A very pleasant prospect. Aha! I believe I hear my wife down below. You mean only recent graves produce ghosts? Rose asked, trying for a light note, as she followed him downstairs again. Spirits, my dear, spirits. Of course. They wear out in the end. Burn out, if you like, just like a candle flame. Spirits are not immortal any more than bodies. They simply have a more energy and a longer lifespan. Thank you, Laura, he added, receiving a plastic garment bag, evidently stuffed with clothes, from his wife, who stood nervously by the open front door. And of course, he added to Rose, nonplussed in the hall, it is when they have just left their bodies that spirits are most agitated, not yet knowing, you see, quite where they stand. Ha ha! His chuckle was like ice cubes falling into a glass. He retired up the stairs again with the dress bag, and Mrs. Colgate went back to their car, which was parked on the pavement outside, with the policeman eyeing it thoughtfully. I hope you don't mind our coming a little earlier, he said. Mrs. Colgate fluttered up the front steps again with the bundle of golf clubs and fishing rods.
and the tube of a vacuum cleaner. The Admiral thought it would be more practical to leave during the daylight. It gets dark so early these days, and then it's so hard to find things. She handed the clubs and rods to her husband, who, still in pursuit of his previous theme, said airily, waving a butterfly net, "Yes, yes, spirits, when they have just left their bodies, buzz around in quite a panic. Like wasps, you know, positively distilling energy." He bustled off up the stairs again. He could move amazingly nimbly for one so fat, calling back what sounded like, "That's the time to catch them." Rose went away to her own kitchen to be by herself. She supposed she had better make the Colgates a cup of tea. That was the proper way to welcome people. She wished that she had not taken such an instantaneous aversion to Desmond Colgate. Probably he was quite ordinary and pleasant when one got to know him. He couldn't help that unnerving voice and fish-like complexion. During the weekend, the Colgates seemed to settle in very completely in their own way. They had brought no furniture. Indeed, they had no need to, for the rooms were fully furnished, but they had an incredible quantity of paraphernalia: bundles, boxes, rolls, frames, cages, baskets. As they carried these up, Rose could not conceive where they would stow all the stuff in her two moderate-sized rooms, and indeed, when she tapped and entered with the ceremonial cups of tea, the floor was completely covered with objects dumped higgledy-piggledy, and the owners were making no attempt to organize the chaos. They were seated, he on the chaise longue, and she on the divan, each with an half-empty glass in hand. A Johnny Walker bottle stood on a box midway between them. "You see us exhausted, my dear Rose," chirped Mr. Colgate. I may call you Rose, may I not?" "Such a charming name, recruiting our strength before embarking on the next stage of our labours. R.T. What a considerate thought. How delicious." But Rose noticed when she carried the cups down again that he had hardly touched his, taken no more than a courtesy sip. Was the silence interrupted by her entry a sullen silence, an acrimonious silence, a conspiratorial silence? There had been a positive quality to it. Of that Rose felt certain. And on the Sunday, as she went about her weekend tasks and tended the children, she could not avoid the irrational notion that the Colgates, mousy quiet themselves, they seemed to be late risers, were, as she swept or clinked pots in the kitchen, or merely ran up and down stairs, sitting motionless as she had first discovered them, listening to her. On Sunday evening, Dr. Cobb dropped in, unannounced. "Passing by, thought I might as well. Temperature's down yet? Never mind, it has to take its course. Keep 'em in bed, though. No getting up to watch telly. That measle bug's a bad one. Young Pete Finn, the vet's son, know what I mean. Round-faced boy," she nodded. "Took pneumonia. Died this morning. Couldn't get the temperature down." Pete Finn." She was transfixed by a pang of pity and terror. But he's such a big, strong boy. We know him well. He was a friend of Bob's." Cobb shook his head. "Didn't make it. Don't tell you this to scare you, just to warn. Well, keep on with the pills, all you can do." He made for the door fast, turned to say with a touch of inquisitiveness and something else, malice and his good nature, "Here you've got new lodgers." He jerked his thumb upwards. "They didn't stay in his father's house too long." "You know the Admiral, then?" He nodded. He knew everybody. "Patient. Haven't met the younger generation, though. Been in foreign parts, haven't they? Good thing they left the old boy, rubbing him up the wrong way. He said they were hastening his end. Behaving themselves here, are they?" "They seem fine. Why?" She was instantly alarmed. "Oh, nothing. Glad you found somebody. Only I did hear," he gestured, tipping up an invisible glass. Oh, thought Rose, that would explain the shaking hands and trouble about driving. "Both," she mouthed unhappily. He shrugged. "Only in moderation, I dare say. Could be worse. Could be heroin. Take care now. Call me at the least worry." With a carefree slam, he was into his car and away. On Monday, a prey to hideous qualms and misgivings, Rose drove to the office of Woman's Scene. She had left prepared food of every kind ready to be fed to her children, a paper tacked to the wall with her phone number, the doctor's number, the plumber, electrician, hospital, typed instructions, stuck on all the household appliances. For Mrs. Colgate had asked if she might use the washing machine, the iron, sewing machine, vacuum. My father-in-law was always terribly difficult about letting us use his things, she confided. Press week on the magazine was always a scramble of last-minute work. Rose found it impossible to leave the office before 6:30. She arrived home late and in trepidation, though Mrs. Colgate that morning had been wholly friendly and reassuring. Mr. Colgate had not been visible. Don't you worry about a thing, my dear. It will really be a pleasure to look after your nice children, dear little things. She had seemed decidedly calmer than on the day they arrived. Her hands shook less. When Rose opened the door, the house was totally silent, and downstairs all in darkness. She flipped a switch, no light. In a panic, she ran up the stairs. Here, there was darkness too, though dim lights came from the children's rooms. When she went in to see Titch, Rose discovered the source of this subdued light. Mr. Colgate was there reading Kim aloud to her daughter by the flicker of two candles. His high, monotonous, bird-like voice, which had seemed, as she entered, mysteriously to come from somewhere in the ceiling, ceased when he saw Rose. Despite the dim light, he was still wearing his eye shade. "Ah, there you are at last, my dear," he said graciously to Rose. "Then I will retire." Has everything been all right?" Rose hoped that the nervousness and dislike in her voice were not as audible to him as they seemed to her. "Just as right as it could be," Mr. Colgate declared with greater gaiety. He added judiciously, "But I believe your daughter is not very used to men." "My husband died when she was only 3. "Ah, I see. That explains it. So long ago," he sighed. "Might I ask, did your husband live here when he was alive, in this house?" "No, we moved here after his death." "Ah, too bad." He seemed disappointed. "I was asking the children about him." He took a step, and a strong, sweetish scent of whiskey and hair oil was released. Rose longed for him to be gone. She could see what seemed to have escaped Mr. Colgate's notice under the eye shade and the dim light, that Titch was in a silent agony of terrified tears that might at any minute reach screaming pitch. "Well, good night, Mr. Colgate. Thank you so much." And as he mercifully left the room, and she heard his own door shut behind him, "My lamb, what's the matter?" Titch flung herself quivering into her mother's arms. "He's horrible. I couldn't understand a single word he said, not a word. His voice is so strange. It seemed to come from the roof. And he smells awful. Please, don't let him come in here any more." "No, of course I won't." With sinking heart, Rose wondered how this was to be achieved without mortally offending Mr. Colgate. She suspected that he might be a very touchy man. As soon as she could detach herself from the panic-stricken Titch, Rose went to visit Bob. Here the scene seemed calmer. Bob was sitting up in a bed, flushed but impassive, wrapped in a quilt, playing cards on a pastry board with Mrs. Colgate. 2 more flickering candles lit the room. "Your son has a natural aptitude for cards," Mrs. Colgate said, smiling, ducking out from under the sloping roof. "I've taught him Spider, and before he learned Napoleon, Streets and Alleys, Klondike, and the Beleaguered Castle. He learns like lightning." "Bless him," Rose stroked the tousled fair head. "It's so kind of you." With relief, she saw that Bob, though not in the best of spirits, had not been reduced to Titch's state of despair. She felt his forehead. It was very hot. He twitched away nervously from her street-cold hand. "Why all the candles?" Rose asked. "Did the main fuse blow?" "I can't say." Mrs. Colgate looked vague. "Something went wrong. But anyway, my husband and I really prefer candlelight." Rose did not. In a Tudor house largely constructed of timber and lath, candles were too great a fire hazard, and she groped her way down to the cellar and mended the 3 separate fuses that seemed to have blown. However, Even when the rest of the rooms were blazing with light, she noticed, when outside, fetching her briefcase from the car, that only a dim flicker still emanated from the Colgate's windows. I hope to God they've tidied up all that clutter, she thought apprehensively. She could hardly forbid the Colgates to use candles if such was their preference, but it did seem risky with all those obstacles on the floor to trip them. Perhaps they were straight by now, though. Later on in the evening, she was obliged to visit their room. The phone rang. It was a male voice asking for Mr. Desmond Colgate. "What name shall I say?" inquired Rose. "Hugh Morgan Sleigh, Admiral Colgate's solicitor. I've been trying this number all day," said the voice irritably. "I'll see if they're in, but I rather believe I heard them go out half an hour ago," said Rose. As she gulped down her hasty, late supper, she had heard footsteps and mutterings on the stairs. Pondering, she tapped on the Colgate's door. Twice during the day she had tried to phone home in order to ask after the children, but had got no reply on either occasion. Were the Colgates telephones shy? The tapping produced no response, and she cautiously opened the door, automatically switching on the light. Something scurried hastily in a corner. She caught a glimpse of a smallish, whitish creature which vanished under a corner of blanket hanging from the divan. The Colgates were nowhere to be seen, and the rooms were still just as untidy as they had been 4 days ago. A guttering candle leaned precariously over the edge of a saucer. Rose extinguished it and went back to the phone. "They must be out, I'm afraid. Shall I leave them a message to call you?" "That won't be any use," he said sourly. "I suppose I shall have to come and see them to explain the Admiral's intentions." He sounded as if he found the prospect intensely disagreeable. "You might catch them at friends, if you have any idea where to phone," Rose suggested. "More likely in a pub," he muttered to himself, not Rose, and rang off. She had intended to wait up in order to tell them about the call, and also ask about the creature. What could it have been? A ferret? A lizard? A koipu? But they returned home so extremely late that by the time they came in she had given up and, exhausted, retired to bed. She slept lightly, though, and heard their shuffling feet on the stairs after the church clock struck 1. Not a pub, then. Mr. Morgan's sleigh must have been wrong about that. In the morning, there was no sound from the Colgate area. Not daring to leave the children, both running fevers, without being certain that somebody was alert enough to tend to their needs, Rose waited as long as possible, then tapped at the door. A very long silence ensued. Rose tapped again. A drowsy voice called, "Who is it?" "It's me, Rose. I'm sorry to disturb you." After another long pause, Mrs. Colgate came flapping to the door in a faded silk wrapper that must have once been memorably ornate. Her face was chalk pale. Her hands shook wildly. Rose passed on the lawyer's message, which Mrs. Colgate received without expression, and then added, "I'm sorry to bother you." Why did she keep saying that? It wasn't true. "But I just phoned the doctor, and he says if the children's temperatures aren't down by noon, get in touch with him and he'll come round. Just phone him and he'll come," she repeated, as Mrs. Colgate continued to look unreceptive. "Phone the doctor? Oh, I won't do that. I'll run round to the surgery," Mrs. Colgate said after a pause. "I've seen it. It's in the square, isn't it?" "Yes," said Rose, rather astonished. "But you'd much better phone. He won't be there. He'll be on his rounds. They'll have to find him." "I'll go," repeated Mrs. Colgate. "I like fresh air." "You won't forget, will you?" There was something so odd about the woman that Rose was deeply troubled at having to leave the children in her charge. She went on. I don't like to seem a silly, fussing parent, but since the news about poor little Peter Finn's death—" "Peter Finn's death?" Mrs. Colgate looked a little more intelligent. "The vet's boy at South Dean. Such a sweet boy. He used to wash our car, and my husband taught him to play cribbage." Mention of the vet reminded Rose of something. "By the way, do you have a pet? When I looked in here last night, I thought I saw... The thing is, I hadn't really reckoned. The house isn't very big." For several moments, Mrs. Colgate remained quite silent, her face non-committal. Then, as if after reflection, she said, A pet. I thought when I went up about the phone call I saw something like a ferret. Oh, you mean my sister's Chinese rabbit, Mrs. Colgate said, as if suddenly enlightened. Don't worry, I'll take it back to her today. And she added, we don't like pets at all, don't worry, she finished absently. Rose nodded, left the house and ran to her car. She was very late, and it was beginning to snow. On both the following evenings, the lights were all fused when Rose arrived home. Some activity of the Colgates apparently put an excessive strain on the wiring. Mending the fuses, Rose resolved to ask them about it when she had a little more time. But there were so many things on her mind as well. The children's still soaring temperatures, the unsorted mess in the Colgates' rooms, visible whenever they briefly left the door open, ought Rose to help them tidy it. The intermittent snow, which made driving a terror to Rose, never confident in the car at the best of times. The hectic going-to-press, non-stop action of the magazine. Then, on Wednesday evening, there came a call from the police. Mrs. Burdock, Sergeant Grimble here. I believe you have a Mr. Colgate staying with you who owns a white Cortina, registration DDR 01439J. Would you mind telling him he's parked it illegally in Mary Lane, and unless it's removed within half an hour, it will be towed away at his expense? Oh, yes, I'll tell him. Very kind of you to tip him off, Rose said to Sergeant Grimble, who was an old friend. And he said, confidentially, they keep leaving their car in all sorts of crazy places. You'd better warn them, or they're in for trouble. Oh, good heavens, said Mr. Colgate irritably when Rose relayed this message to him, somewhat watered down. I must say it is a great pity we are not permitted to put our car in the graveyard next door. There would be plenty of room among the trees. This town is so awkward and confusing at night, as the streets are so poorly lit. Ironic that he, with his preference for candlelight, should complain of that, Rose thought. He went on. Quite often in the morning, other people have parked so inconsiderately that it is almost impossible for us to locate our car. My poor wife had to spend several hours today searching for it. This explained Bob's complaint. We didn't get our lunch today till 4, Mum. Need these Colgates stay. I don't really like them. Oh dear, love, nor do I much. But they are keeping an eye on you, and they paid a month's rent in advance. What don't you like about them? Everything. And his puppets are the absolute end. Puppets? He makes them out of china or something. They clink. He showed me a couple this afternoon when we were playing cards. One moved by itself. Horrible. We played canasta, and he said if I won, I could have one of the smaller puppets. But I wouldn't want one. They give me the creeps. Anyway, I didn't win. On Thursday morning, early, Mrs. Joubert sent for Rose. The magazine had been safely put to bed. There was time to draw breath. Rose hurried to the editor's office, wondering what fault or omission of hers had come under scrutiny. She could think of several possibilities in the last few desperate days. But this summons was of a personal nature. Mrs. Joubert came to the point directly. I've just been talking to my housekeeper at South Dean. She tells me she heard the young Colgates had rented rooms in your house. Young Colgates? Rose would hardly have classified them as that, but she supposed that compared with the Admiral in his late 80s, they rated as young. Yes, that's right. Well, get them out at once. You can't let them stay in your house. But Rose stammered, utterly taken aback. They gave you as a reference. That was why I let them come. Like their impudence. They'd no right to, Mrs. Joubert said incisively. My dear, they nearly drove that wretched old man mad. He said they were hurrying him towards his end. They are an appalling couple. What's the matter with them? Well, they drink like fishes for a start. But there are much worse things. They have all kinds of murky habits. You have got to get rid of them. But they've paid a month's rent. Pay it back. Get them out. How can I possibly do that? Invent something. Say you've got your mother-in-law coming to live with you. I'm serious. But they're looking after my children who have mumps and measles. Rose felt herself close to fainting with sheer despair. You'll just have to take some time off, Mrs. Joubert said impatiently. Luckily, we've just gone to press. In a small, detached, ironic corner of her mind, Rose wondered if the time off would have been granted otherwise. Don't come until next Monday. Tell them some story. Fix something, okay? And you'd better leave early today. Nonetheless, there was much clearing up to do after the scrambled press day. The January afternoon was darkening by the time Rose parked the Mini opposite her front door. The sight of Dr. Cobb's car arrogantly straddling the double lines across the road turned her cold with apprehension. I'm afraid a lad's coming down with measles too, the doctor told her outside Bob's door. This is really going to be a tricky time. I've left a lot of new medicine for him to take. Try an ice pack and lots of fluids. I'll be back later this evening. You don't think he should go into hospital? Rose tried to keep her voice level. My dear, they're packed to the gills. Still, don't worry. See you later. Don't worry, Rose thought, pressing both hands against her aching temples. 10 minutes afterwards, as she ran up the stairs with a jug of barley water, she found her way impeded by Mr. Colgate, fatly occupying most of the narrow landing. I'm taking these in to amuse him, he chirped gaily. She was too exhausted to pretend. No, he doesn't want anything like that, Mr. Colgate. He's far too sick. Yet, there was something rather repulsively fascinating about Mr. Colgate's puppets, which he held dangling from either hand. China, Bob had said, and she had thought he must be mistaken. But in fact, the puppets were made of ceramic, a series of bell-shaped pottery pieces, a large one for the body, with painted face, and smaller ones for the arms and legs, each slotting into the one above, threaded on leather thongs. They clinked slightly as they moved. The faces, though depicted by no more than half a dozen strokes of black and white paint, wore such expressions of malign hostility that it was easy to see why they had upset Bob. Thank heaven Titch had not seen them. He's too sick, Rose repeated firmly. Poor boy, Mr. Colgate sighed. It's hard when one is young to be so very ill. You're sure I couldn't show him just one puppet? I have a big one, bigger than these, which moves all by itself. I've trained it to do that. He liked that one. No thanks, Mr. Colgate. Mrs. Colgate opened the door and put her face round. She looked fatigued and frightened. For a moment, Rose thought she could hear a faint, high-pitched crying coming from the room behind her. Then she stepped out and closed the door. Ventriloquism, said her husband. Did you know I could throw my voice, my dear Rose? He twitched his face, and a squeaky voice came from among the rafters up above them. Let me out, let me out. Don't do that, Desmond, said his wife hastily. Tell me, where did you put the collecting bottle? I need it for... I'm trying to divert our dear Rose, Laura. Well, she isn't amused. Where did you leave the bottle? I dare say it's in the car, he replied pettishly. Where's the car? God knows if you don't, he snapped, and went into their room, slamming the door. For the instant that it was open, Rose thought she heard the crying again. Then there was a thump and silence. Am I going mad? She wondered, carrying the barley water into Bob. He was slightly delirious and pushed her away, crying, Don't you let them near me or I'll smash them. Titch, too, was worse that evening and complained of pains all round her neck, but she would still take fruit juice, which Bob refused. Rose, squeezing oranges in her kitchen, was interrupted by Mr. Colgate, who seemed aggrieved. I'm very fond of your children, he announced aggressively. That's kind of you, Mr. Colgate. I'm sure you are. Then why does your daughter scream like a maniac when I go into her room? She's very sick. She's only 8. She's not used to men. She's used to the doctor. That's different. She's known him for years. I would like to teach her to play clock patience. Any child her age can learn that. Mr. Colgate, I would rather you didn't go into her room just at present. He looked at Rose loweringly, but at this moment his wife came in, flustered, brushing snowflakes off her shabby headscarf. Desmond, I can't find the car. Can't you remember where we left it last? You were driving. No, I wasn't, she began, but he dragged her sharply out into the passage. Rose heard them squabbling. You must remember. Well, I don't. You were driving. Shut up. Try to think where you put it. I didn't put it anywhere. I've looked all over the town. If we don't find that bottle soon, it'll be... They're getting fractious. I don't hear anything. That's because you're deaf, Desmond. He was a bit deaf, Rose had noticed. Often she had to repeat things she said to him. Did you try in the alley next to the library where it says librarian only? No, I didn't. I think it might be there. Go and see. You go and quiet them down then. Put them in the bird cage. When the Colgates had departed, Rose took Titch her orange juice. She thought she could hear a kind of scuffle taking place in the Colgates' room, mixed with subdued curses. Just as she was carrying the empty beaker downstairs again, Mrs. Colgate came in through the front door. Evidently her quest this time had been successful. She bore a heavy-looking gallon-sized flagon made of black glass. It was encased in a sort of basket-work, which was covered all over with beads, black, green, blue, red, and white. The beading formed letters, which ran criss-cross, up, down, and sideways, like a crossword puzzle. In her brief glimpse, Rose saw no word she recognized, but noticed the letters O-A-T-N-E-S. It was an extremely foreign-looking article. Perhaps the Colgates had brought it back with them from Tehran. What could they keep in it that was required with such urgency? Although the black glass looked massively thick, the frail Mrs. Colgate appeared to be able to carry it without too much difficulty, as if the contents were light. It could be oxygen, thought Rose, or crushed laurel leaves for killing moths. Why did they call it a collecting bottle? She went upstairs again to read aloud to Titch, who complained that she ached all over. The crying from the Colgates' room had ceased. Rose decided that she had imagined it. Dr. Cobb came back at 11 and said that Bob was holding his own. You get a bit of sleep now, and have a look at him around 2. Call me if you're at all bothered, he said. Try to sleep a little now. Okay, you're very good, Rose muttered. The Colgates, according to evening custom, had gone out. Rose suppressed an urge to bolt the front door so that they could not get back in. She could not resist the temptation to peep into their room. The floor was still covered with things. The plastic garment bag hung from a rafter, swaying slightly. Near the door stood the large bird cage, covered by a square of red baize. Gingerly, Rose twitched the baize up and let it drop again, with a shudder of disgust. On the floor of the cage were 3 smallish, whitish, wrinkled things, huddled together, motionless. What could they have been? They resembled embryos with horrible little tapering, attenuated limbs. They reminded her vaguely of William Blake's paintings. They couldn't have been alive. They couldn't have been real, she told herself. It was just a pile of chamois leather or something like that, bits of crumpled plastic, perhaps. Tomorrow, she would give the Colgates notice to go, the first thing in the morning, as soon as she saw them. Trembling, she shut the door again, went to her own room, set the alarm for 2 a.m., and fell on the bed, fully clothed. She had thought she would never go to sleep, but she went off instantly, as if she had swallowed a knockout dose, and immediately began to dream. She dreamed that she was watching Desmond Colgate and her son play cards. The cards were laid out like gravestones all over a flat board, and the room was lit by 2 candles, one black, one white. Mr. Colgate pointed to the candles and said, You remember what the Egyptians believed. We are split into 10 parts, of which this is the ka, or double, and that the ku, or spirit. Are you paying attention, boy? Yes, Bob said sleepily. He was lolling back on the pillow, hardly able to keep his eyes open. Very well. We shall play Devil's Bedpost, Colgate said, and he began moving the cards into a square formation. The winner takes both candles, right? Don't play with him, Bob, Rose wanted to scream, but her voice remained trapped inside. Her lips would not open. The players began moving the cards about, murmuring incomprehensible terms. I buy the devil. I cross the equator. Cold hand takes the tiger. Go now. Queen of the night takes 10. Suddenly, Colgate slapped all his cards down on the board, shouting, "Dead hand, I win." And picking up a black conical candle extinguisher, he snuffed out both flames and put the candles in his pocket. Rose thought she had woken herself by shrieking, but found that it was the shrilling of the alarm in her ear that had roused her. She stumbled out of bed and quietly opened her bedroom door. On the landing, she was dismayed to see Desmond Colgate also fully clothed. He seemed to be coming from Bob's room and was carrying a flashlight which cast a small round pool of light before him on the floor. He did not observe Rose. He opened his own door and exclaimed in a harsh whisper, "Laura! Laura! The little brute got away! Where did you leave the bottle?" A sleepy voice answered, "It's back in the car." "Where's the bloody car?" "Don't you remember? You left it in the graveyard." He spun round, and Rose heard the thump of his feet down the stairs and the soft slam of the front door. Aghast, she stepped to the landing window, which also looked out onto the graveyard, thrust back the curtain, and saw, in bright moonlight against the snow, the Colgate's car drawn up askew just inside the gate. She was in time to see Colgate. He held the wicker-wrapped flask in one hand, what looked like a white towel in the other. He was dashing about among the gravestones, apparently in pursuit of some elusive and darting quarry. He made frantic flaps and lunges with the cloth, blundered into the stone slabs, tripped, picked himself up again, and stumbled on. But presently, dropping the bottle, he pressed both hands violently against his breastbone, as if coughing or choking, stood in this position anchored for several moments, then fell heavily onto the snow and lay still. Rose heard the shallow breathing behind her and turned to see Laura Colgate looking past her shoulder. "What is it? What is it?" she muttered apprehensively, pushing aside her dangling hair with tremulous hands. "Your husband's out in the graveyard, Mrs. Colgate," said Rose bleakly. "I think you had better go to him. He seems to have been taken ill." Whimpering in distress, the other woman shuffled down the stairs. "Desmond, Desmond, why wouldn't you wait for me?" she called plaintively, and the door slammed behind her. Rose waited a moment, saw her approach her husband's body, stoop and recoil with upflung hands, glancing suspiciously round her as if expecting crowds of onlookers. Rose turned and ran to her son's room. His window stood wide open. A scatter of cards lay over the quilt. Bob was sprawled in the bed, motionless, with his face to the wall. Rose, trying to keep her fingers steady on his wrist, could find no pulse. She ran down the stairs to the telephone. "Mum, I'm thirsty," came in a feeble croak from Titch's room. "Just a minute, love. Shan't be long." Rose began dialing the doctor's number. As she did so, she heard the front door close and Mrs. Colgate's dragging steps cross the front hall.
Out of the Deep by Walter de la Mare. The steely light of daybreak, increasing in volume and intensity as the east grew larger with the day, showed clearly at length that the prodigious yet elegant Arabian bed was empty. What might tenderly have cradled the slumbers of some exquisite fare of romance now contained no human occupant at all. The whole immense room, its air dry and thin as if burnt, was quiet as a sepulchre. To the right of the bed towered a vast and heavily carved wardrobe. To the left, a lofty fireplace of stone flanked by its grinning frigid dogs. A few cumbrous and obscure oil paintings hung on the walls, and like the draperies of a proscenium, the fringed and valanced damask curtains on either side, the two high windows, poured down their motionless cataract of crimson. They had been left undrawn overnight, and yet gave the scene a slight theatricality, a theatricality which the painted nymphs disporting themselves on the ceiling scarcely helped to dispel. Not that these coy and ogling faces suggested any vestige of chagrin at the absence of the young man, who for some weeks past had shared the long nights with them. They merely smiled on, for after all, Jimmy's restless head upon the pillow had never really been in harmony with his pompous, inanimate surroundings. The thin, high nose, like the beak of a small ship, between the fast-sealed lids and narrow cheekbones, the narrow bird-like brow, the shell of the ear slightly pointed. If, inspired by the distant music of the spheres the painted creatures had with this daybreak broken into song, it would certainly not have been to the tune of "Oh, where and oh, where is my little dog gone?" There was even less likelihood of Jimmy's voice now taking up their strains from out of the distance. And yet, to judge from appearances, the tongue within that head might have been that of an extremely vivacious talker, even though, apart from Mrs. Thrips, its talk, these last few days, had been for the most part with himself. Indeed, as one of his friends had remarked, "Don't you believe it, Jimmy has pots and pots to say, though he don't say it. That's what makes him such a damn good loser." Whether or not, if Jimmy had been in the habit of conversing with himself, he must have had odd company at times. Night after night he had lain there, flat on his back, his hands crossed on his breast, a pose that never failed to amuse him. A smooth eminence in the dark, rich quilt about 60 inches from his chin indicated to his attentive eye the points of his toes. The hours had been heavy. The hours had been long. Still, there were only 12 or so of utter darkness in the most tedious of nights, and the matins tinkled at length. Excepting the last of them, a night which was now apparently forever over, he had occupied this majestic bed for about 6 weeks, though on no single occasion could he have confessed to being really at home in it. He had chosen it not from any characteristic whim or caprice, and certainly not because it dominated the room in which his Uncle Timothy himself used to sleep. Yes, and for 40 years on end, only at last to expire in it. He had chosen it because, when its Venetian blinds were pulled high up under the fringed cornice, it was as light as a London April sky could make it, and because, well, just one single glance in from the high narrow doorway upstairs had convinced him that the attic in which he was wont to sleep as a small boy was simply out of the question. A black, heavy flood of rage swept over him at sight of it. He had never before positively realized the abominations of that early past. To a waif and stray, any kind of shelter is of course a godsend, but even though this huge, sumptuous barrack of a house had been left to him, or rather abandoned to him, by his Uncle Timothy's relict, Aunt Charlotte, Jimmy could not, even at his loosest, have been described as homeless. Friendless, rather, but that of his own deliberate choice. Not so very long ago, in fact, he had made a clean sweep of every single living being, male or female, to whom the term friend could, with some little elasticity, be applied. A little official affair, to put it politely, eased their exit. And then, this vacant hostel. The house, in fact, occupied only by a caretaker in the service of his aunt's lawyers, had been his for the asking at any time during the last 2 or 3 years, but he had steadily delayed taking possession of it, until there was practically no alternative. Circumstances accustom even a young man to a good many inconveniences. Still, it would have been a little too quixotic to sleep in the street, even though his Uncle Timothy's house, as mere property, was little better than a white and unpleasing elephant. He could not sell it, that is, not en masse. It was more than dubious if he was legally entitled to make away with its contents. But quite apart from an extreme aversion to your Uncle Timothy's valuables in themselves, you cannot eat, even if you can subsist on, articles of virtue. Sir Richard Grenville, a hero for whom Jimmy had every respect, may have been accustomed to chewing up his wine glass after swigging off its contents, but this must have been on the spur of an impulse, hardly in obedience to the instinct of self-preservation. Jimmy would have much preferred to balance a chair at the foot of his uncle's Arabian bed and salute the smiling lips of the painted nymphs on the ceiling, though even that experiment would probably have a rather gritty flavour. Still, possession is 9 points of the law, and necessity is the deadly enemy of convention. Jimmy was unconscious of the faintest scruples on that score. His scruples, indeed, were in another direction. Only a few days ago, the day in fact before his first indulgence in the queer experience of pulling the bell, he had sallied out with his Aunt Charlotte's black leather dressing bag positively bulging with a pair of bow candlesticks, an illuminated missal mutely exquisite with its blues and golds and crimsons, and a tiny old silver-gilt bijouterie box. He was a young man of absurdly impulsive aversions, and the dealer to whom he carried this further consignment of loot was one of them. After a rapid and contemptuous examination, this gentleman spread out his palms, shrugged his shoulders, and suggested a sum that would have caused even a more phlegmatic connoisseur than his customer's Uncle Timothy to turn in his grave. And Jimmy replied, nicely slurring his R's, "Really, Mr. So-and-so, it is impossible. No doubt these things have an artificial value, but not for me. I must ask you to oblige me by giving me only half the sum you have kindly mentioned. Rather than accept your figure, I would, well, perhaps it would be impolite to tell you what I would prefer to do. Dies irae, dies ille, and so on." The dealer flushed, though he had been apparently content to leave it at that. He was not the man to be easily insulted by a good customer, and Jimmy's depredations were methodical. With the fastidiousness of an expert, he selected from the rare and costly contents of the house only what was light and portable and became inconspicuous by its absence. The supply, he realized, though without any perceptible animation, however recklessly it might be squandered, would easily last out his lifetime. Certainly not. After having once made up his mind to accept his Uncle Timothy's posthumous hospitality, the real difficulty was unlikely to be a conscientious one. It was the attempt merely to accustom himself to the house, the hated house, that grew more and more arduous. It falsified his hope that, like other experiences, this one would prove only the more piquant for being so precarious. Days and moments quickly flying, just as one funny old charwoman, Mrs. Thrips himself, and the past. After pausing a while under the dingy and dusty portico, Jimmy had entered into his inheritance on the last afternoon in March. The wind was fallen. The day was beginning to narrow. A chill crystal light hung over the unshuttered staircase. By sheer force of a forgotten habit, he at once ascended to the attic in which he had slept as a child. Pausing on the threshold, he looked in, conscious not so much of the few familiar sticks of furniture, the truckle bed, the worn strip of Brussels carpet, the chipped blue-banded ewer and basin, the framed illuminated text on the walls, as of a perfect hive of abhorrent memories, that high cupboard in the corner from which certain bodiless shapes had been wont to issue and stoop at him, cowering out of his dreams, the crab-patterned paper that came alive as you stared, the window cold with menacing stars, the mouse holes, the rusty grate trumpet of every wind that blows. These objects at once lustily shouted at him in their own original tongues. Quite apart from themselves, they reminded him of incidents and experiences which at the time could scarcely have been so nauseous as they now seemed in retrospect. He found himself suffocatingly resentful even of what must have been kindly intentions. He remembered how his Aunt Charlotte used to read to him, with her puffy cheeks, plum-ringed hands, and the moving orbs of her eyes showing under her spectacles. He wasn't exactly accusing the past. Even in his first breaches, he was never what could be called a nice little boy. He had never ordered himself lowly and reverently to any of his betters, at least in their absence. Nevertheless, what stirred in his bosom as he gazed in on this discarded scene was certainly not remorse. He remembered how gingerly and with what peculiar breathings his Uncle Timothy used to lift his microscope out of its wooden case, and how, after the necessary manipulation of the instrument, he himself would be bidden mount a footstool and fix his dazzled eye on the slides of sluggish or darting horrors of minute, magnified life. And how, after a steady, awing drawl of inapprehensible instruction, his uncle would suddenly flick out a huge silk pocket handkerchief as a signal that little tongue-tied nervous boys were themselves nothing but miserable, sluggish or darting reptiles, and that his nephew was the most deplorable kind of little boy. Jimmy remembered too once asking the loose bow-shaped old gentleman in his chair if he might himself twist the wheel, and his Uncle Timothy had replied in a loud ringing voice and almost as if he were addressing a public meeting. My boy, I say no to that." He said no to most things, and just like that, if he vouchsafed speech at all. And then there was church on Sundays, and his hoop on weekdays in the Crescent, and days when, with nothing to do, little Jimmy had been wont to sit watching the cold silvery rain on the window, the body he was in slowly congealing the while into a species of rancid suet pudding. Mornings, too, when his Aunt Charlotte would talk nasally to him about Christianity, or when he was allowed to help his uncle and a tall, scared parlour-maid dust and rearrange the contents of a cabinet or bureau. The smell of the air, the check duster, the odious objet d'art, and the aging old man snorting and looking like a superannuated silliness beside the neat and frightened parlour-maid. It was a curious thing, though death with his lowering grin had beckoned him off, there he was, alive as ever. And when, amid these ruminations, Jimmy's eyes had at last fixed themselves on the frayed, dangling cord that hung from the ceiling over the truckle bed, it was because he had already explored all that the name Soames had stood for. Soames, the butler, a black-clothed, tub-bellied, pompous man that might have been his Uncle Timothy's impoverished first cousin or illegitimate step-brother. Soames. Soames used frequently to wring Jimmy's then protuberant ears. Soames sneaked habitually, and with a sort of gloating piety on his drooping face, was invariably present at the subject castigation. Soames had been wont to pile up his plate with lumps of fat that even destiny had never intended should consort with any single leg of mutton or even sirloin of beef. Jelly-like, rapidly cooling nuggets of fat. And Soames invariably brought him cold rice pudding when there was hot ginger roll. Jimmy remembered the lines that drooped down from his long, pale nose, the sleek set of his whiskers as he stood there and his coat tails reflected in the glass of the sideboard, carving the Sunday joint. But that slack green bell cord, his very first glimpse of it had set waggling scores of peculiar remembrances. First, and not so very peculiarly perhaps, it recalled an occasion when, as he stood before his aunt's footstool to bid her good night, her aggrieved pupils had visibly swum down from beneath their lids out of a nap to fix themselves and look at him at last, as if neither he nor she, either in this or in any other world, had ever so much as seen one another before. Perhaps his own face, if not so puffy, appeared that evening to be unusually pasty and pallid, with those dark rings which even to this day added vivacity and lustre to his extremely clear eyes. And his Aunt Charlotte had asked him why he was such a cowardly boy, and so wickedly frightened of the dark. "You know very well your dear uncle will not permit gas in the attic, so there's no use asking for it. You have nothing on your conscience, I trust. You have not been talking to the servants." Infallible liar, He had shaken his head, and his Aunt Charlotte in return wagged hers at him. "It's no good staring in that rebellious, sullen way at me. I have told you repeatedly that if you're really in need of anything, just ring the bell for Soames. A good little boy with nothing on his conscience knows that God watches over him. I hope you're at least trying to be a good little boy. There is a limit, even to your uncle's forbearance." It was perfectly true. Even bad little boys might be watched over in the dead of night. And as for his Uncle Timothy's forbearance, he had discovered the limitations of that fairly early in life. Well, it was a pity, he smiled to himself, that his Aunt Charlotte could not be present to see his Uncle Timothy's bedroom on that first celebration of their prodigal nephew's return. Jimmy's first foray had been to range the house from attic to cellar, where he had paused to rest, for candlesticks, and that night something like 6 dozen of the best wax watched over his heavy and galvanic slumbers in the Arabian bed. Aunt Charlotte, now rather more accustomed to the dark even than Jimmy himself, would have opened her eyes at that. Gamblers are naturally superstitious folk, he supposed, but that was the queerest feature of the whole thing. He had not been conscious of even the slightest apprehension or speculation. It was far rather a kind of ribaldry than any sort of foreboding that had lit up positive constellations of candles, as if for a prince's, as if for a princely cardinal's lying in state. It had taken a devil of a time, too. His Uncle Timothy's port was not the less potent for a long spell of obscure mellowing, and the hand that held the taper had been a shaky one. Yet it had proved an amusing process, too. Almost childish. Jimmy hadn't laughed like that for years, certainly until he had been unconscious of the feeblest squeamish inkling of anything apart from old remembrances peculiar in the house. And yet, well, no doubt even the first absurd impulsive experiment that followed had shaken him up. Its result would have been less unexpected if he hadn't made a point and almost a duty of continually patrolling the horrible old vacant London mansion. Hardly a day had lately passed, and there was nothing better to do, but it found him on his rounds. He was not waiting for anything except for the hour, maybe, when he would have to wait no more. Nevertheless, faithful as the sentinel on Elsinore's hoary ramparts, he would find himself day after day treading almost cat-like on from room to room, surveying his paradoxical inheritance, jotting down a list in a nice order of the next sacrifices, grimacing at the Ming divinities, and pirouetting an occasional long nose at the portraits on the walls. He had sometimes had a few words, animated ones too, with Mrs. Thrips, and perhaps if he could have persuaded himself to talk sensibly and not gesticulate, not to laugh himself so easily into a fit of coughing, she would have proved better company. She was amazingly honest and punctual and quiet, and why to heaven a woman with such excellent qualities should customarily wear so scared a gleam in her still, colourless eyes, and be so idiotically timid and nervous in his company, he couldn't imagine. She was being paid handsome wages anyhow, and naturally he was aware of no rooted objection to other people helping themselves, at least if they managed it as skilfully as he did himself. But Mrs. Thrips, it seemed, had never been able in any sense at all to help herself. She was simply a crepe-bonneted, motherly creature, if not excessively intelligent, if a little slow in seeing points. It was indeed her alarm when he asked her if she had happened to notice any young man about the house that had irritated him, though of course it was hardly fair not to explain what had given rise to the question. That was perfectly simple. It was like this. For years, for centuries in fact, Jimmy had been, except in certain unusual circumstances, an exceedingly bad sleeper. He still hated sleeping in the dark, but a multitude of candles at various degrees of exhaustion make rather lively company when you are sick of your Uncle Timothy's cellar, and even the best of vintage wines may prove an ineffectual soporific. His, too, was a wretchedly active mind. Even as a boy he had thought a good deal about his uncle and aunt, and Soames, and the house, and the Reverend Mr. Grayson, and spectres, and schoolmasters, and painted nymphs, and running away to sea, and curios, and dead silence, and his early childhood. And though, since then, other enigmas had engaged his attention, This purely automatic and tiresome activity of mine still persisted. On his oath, he had been in some respects and in secret rather a goody-goody little boy, though his piety had been rather the offspring of fear than of love. Had he not been expelled from Mellish's almost solely for that reason? What on earth was the good of repeatedly thrashing a boy when you positively knew that he had lied merely from terror of your roaring voice and horrible white face? But there it was. If there had been someone to talk to, he would not have talked so much to himself. He would not have lain awake thinking, night after night, like a rat in a trap. Thinking was like a fountain. Once it gets going at a certain pressure, well, it is almost impossible to turn it off. And my hat, what odd things come up with the water. On the particular night in question, in spite of the candles and the mice and the moon, he badly wanted company. In a moment of pining yet listless jocosity then, he had merely taken his Aunt Charlotte's advice. True, the sumptuous crimson pleated silk bell-pull dangling like a serpent with a huge tassel for skull over his Uncle Timothy's pillow was a more formidable instrument than the yard or two of frayed green cord in the attic, yet they shared the same purpose. Many a time must his Uncle Timothy have stretched up a large loose hand in that direction when in need of Soames' nocturnal ministrations. And now, alas, both master and man were long since gone the way of all flesh. You couldn't, it appeared, pull bells in your coffin, but Jimmy was not as yet in his coffin, and as soon as his fingers slipped down from the smooth pull, the problem in the abstract, as it were, began to fascinate him. With cold, froggy hands crossed over his beautiful puce-patterned pyjamas, he lay staring at the crimson tassel till he had actually seen the hidden fangs flickeringly jet out at him. The effort, then, must have needed some little courage. It might almost have needed a tinge of inspiration. It was in no sense intended as a challenge. He would, in fact, rather remain alone than chance summoning, well, any once animate relic of the distant past. But obviously, the most practical way of proving, if only to yourself, that you can be content with your own reconnaissances in the very dead of night was to demonstrate to that self that even if you should ask for it, assistance would not be forthcoming. He had been as fantastic as that. At the prolonged, pulsating, faint, distant tintinnabulation, he had fallen back onto his pillow with an absurd little quicket of laughter, like that of a naughty boy up to mischief. But instant sobriety followed. Poor sleepers should endeavour to compose themselves. Tampering with empty space, stirring up echoes in pitch-black pits of darkness is scarcely sedative. And then, as he lay striving with extraordinary fervour not to listen, but to concentrate his mind on the wardrobe and to keep his eyes from the door, that door must gently have opened. It must have opened and as noiselessly closed again. For a more or less decent-looking young man, seemingly not a day older than himself, was now apparent in the room. It might almost be said that he had insinuated himself into the room. But well-trained domestics are accustomed to move their limbs and bodies with a becoming unobtrusiveness. There was also that familiar slight inclination of the apologetic in this young man's pose, as he stood there solitary in his black, in that terrific blaze of candlelight. And for a sheer solid minute, the occupant of the Arabian bed had really stopped thinking. When indeed you positively press your face, so to speak, against the crystalline window of your eyes, your mind is apt to become a perfect vacuum. And Jimmy's first rapid and instinctive "who the devil" had remained inaudible. In the course of the next few days, Jimmy was to become familiar, at least in memory, with the looks of this new young butler or valet. But first impressions are usually the vividest. The dark, blue-grey eyes, the high nose, the scarcely perceptible smile, the slight stoop of the shoulders, there was no doubt of it. There was just a flavour, a flicker there of resemblance to himself. Not that he himself could ever have cut as respectful and respectable a figure as that. And the smile. The fellow seemed to be ruminating over 1,000 dubious, long-interred secrets. Secrets such as one may be a little cautious of digging up even to share with oneself. His face turned sidelong on his pillow. and through air as visibly transparent as a sheet of glass, Jimmy had steadily regarded this strange bell answerer, and the bell answerer had never so much as stirred his frigid, glittering eyes in response. The silence that hung between them produced eventually a peculiar effect on Jimmy. Menials, as a general rule, should be less emphatic personally. Their unobtrusiveness should surely not emphasize their imminence. It had been Jimmy who was the first to withdraw his eyes, only once more to find them settling, as if spellbound, on those of his visitor. Yet, after all, there was nothing to take offence at in the young man's countenance or attitude. He did not seem even to be thinking back at the bell puller, but merely to be awaiting instructions. Yet Jimmy's heart at once rapidly began to beat again beneath his icy hands, and at last he made a perfectly idiotic response. Wagging his head on the pillow, he turned abruptly away. It was only to tell you that I shall need nothing more tonight, he had said. Good heavens, the fatuity of it. He wanted, thirsted for scores upon scores of things. Aladdin's was the cupidity of a simpleton by comparison. Time and the past, for instance, and the ability to breathe again as easily as if it were natural as the processes of digestion. Why, if you were intent only on a little innocent companionship, one or two of those nymphs up there would be far more amusing company than Mrs. Thrips, if, that is, apart from yearning to their harps and viols, they could be persuaded to scrub and sweep. Jimmy wanted no other kind of help. There is a beauty that is but skin deep. Altogether, it had been a far from satisfactory experience. Jimmy was nettled. His mincing tones echoed in on his mind. They must have suggested that he was unaccustomed to men servants and bell pulls and opulent surroundings, and the fellow had instantly taken him at his word. A solemn little rather agreeable and unservile inclination of the not unfriendly head, and he was gone. And there was Jimmy, absolutely exhausted, coughing his lungs out and entirely incapable of concluding whether the new butler was a creature of actuality or of dream. Well, that was nothing new. That's just how things do take on in one's weak moments in the dead of night. Nevertheless, the experience had apparently proved sedative. He had slept like an infant. The morning found him vivacious with curiosity. He had paused to make only an exceedingly negligent toilet before beginning his usual wanderings about the house. Calm, cold daylight reflection may dismiss almost any nocturnal experience as a dream, if at any rate one's temperature in the night hours is habitually above the norm. But Jimmy could not or would not absolutely make up his mind. So clear a picture had his visitant imprinted on his memory that he even found himself, just like a specialist sounding a patient in search of the secret ravages of phthisis, he had even found himself stealthily tapping over the basement walls, as if in search of a concealed pantry. A foolish proceeding if one has not the least desire in the world to attract the attention of one's neighbours. Having at length satisfied himself in a rather confused fashion that whatever understudy of Soames might share the house with him in the small hours, he must be a butler of the migratory order, Jimmy then began experimenting with the bells. Mounted on a kitchen chair, cornice brush in hand, he had been surprised by Mrs. Thrips in her quiet boots. As he stood gently knocking one by one the full 18 of the long, greened, crooked jingle row which hung open-mouthed above the immense dresser. She had caught him in the act, and Jimmy had once more exercised his customary glib presence of mind. They ought to be hung in a scale, you know, oughtn't they, Mrs. Thrips? Then we could have Home Sweet Home, and a hunting up and a hunting down, grand size and treble bobs, and a grand Maximus, even on weekdays. And if we were in danger of any kind of fire, which you will never be, we could ring them backwards, couldn't we, Mrs. Thrips? Not that there's much quality in them, no medieval monkish tone or timbre in them. They're a bit mouldy too, and one can't tell t'other from which. Not like St. Faith's. One would have recognised that old clanker in one's shroud, wouldn't one, Mrs. Thrips? Has it ever occurred to you that the first campanologist's real intention was not so much to call the congregation as to summon, what the congregation's after? Yes, sir, Mrs. Thrips had agreed, her watery grey eyes fixed largely on the elevated young man. But it don't matter which of them you ring. I'll answer Henny. At least while I'm in the house. I don't think, sir. You've rest your mind enough, my own boy now. He's in the Navy. But with one graceful flourish, Jimmy had wrung his long-handled brush clean east to west along the clanging row. You mustn't, he shouted. You shouldn't. Once aboard the lugger, they are free. It's you mothers. He gently shook his peculiar wand at the flat-looking little old woman. No, Mrs. Thrips, what I'm after is he who is here, couchant, perdu, laid, in these same subterranean vaults when you and I are snug in our nightcaps. A most nice-spoken young man, not in the Navy, Mrs. Thrips. And before the old lady had had time to seize any one of these seductive threads of conversation, Jimmy had flashed his usual brilliant smile or grimace at her, and soon afterwards sallied out of the house to purchase a further gross or two of candles, gently and furtively pushing across the counter half a sovereign, not as a douceur, but merely as from friend to friend. He had similarly smiled back at the secretive-looking old assistant in the staid West End family grocer's. No, I didn't suppose you could remember me. One alters, one ages, one deals elsewhere. But anyhow, a Happy New Year to you, if the next ever comes, you know. You see, sir, the straight-aproned old man had retorted with equal confidentiality. It's not so much the alterations. They are what you might call uncircumventable, sir. It's the stream, sir. Behind the counter here, we are like rocks in it. But even if I can't for the moment put a thought to your face, though it's already stirring in me in a manner of speaking, I shall in the future, sir. You may rely upon that. And the same, sir, to you. And many of them, I'm sure. Somehow or other, Jimmy's vanity had been mollified by this pleasing little ceremoniousness, and that even before he had smiled yet once again at the saffron young lady in the pay-box. The truth is, my dear, he had assured himself as he once more ascended into the dingy porch, the truth is, when once you begin to tamper, you won't know where you are. You won't really. And that night he had lain soberly on in a peculiar state of physical quiescence and self-satisfaction, his dark bright eyes wandering from nymph to nymph, his hands folded over his breast under the bedclothes, his heart persisting in its usual habits. Nevertheless, the fountain of his thoughts had continued softly to plash on its worn basin. With ears acock, he had frankly enjoyed inhaling the parched, spent, brilliant air. And when his fingers had at last manifested the faintest possible itch to experiment once more with the bell-pull, he had slipped out of bed, and hastily searching through a little privy case of his uncle's bedside books, had presently slipped back in again, armed with a fat little copy of The Mysteries of Paris in its original French. The next day, a horrible lassitude descended upon him. For the better part of an hour he had stood staring out of the drawing-room window onto the London street. At last, with a yawn that was almost a groan, and with an absurdly disproportionate effort, he turned himself about. Heavily hung the gilded chandeliers in a long vista of the room. Heavily gloomed the gilded furniture. Scarcely distinguishable in the obscurity of the farther wall stood watching him from a mirror what might have appeared to be the shadowy reflection of himself. With a still yet extreme aversion, he kept his eyes fixed on this distant nonentity, hardly realizing his own fantastic resolve that if he did catch the least faint independent movement there, he would give Soames Jr. a caustic piece of his mind. He must have been abominably fast asleep for hours when, a night or two afterwards, he had suddenly awakened, sweat streaming along his body, his mouth stretched to a long, narrow O, and his right hand clutching the bell rope as might a drowning man at a straw. The room was a drowse with light. All was still. The flitting horrors between dream and wake in his mind were already thinning into air. Through their transparency he looked out once more on the substantial, the familiar. His breath came heavily, like puffs of wind over a stormy sea, and yet a profound peace and tranquillity was swathing him in. The relaxed mouth was now faintly smiling. Not a sound, not the feeblest, distant, unintended tinkling was trembling up from the abyss. And for a moment or two the young man refrained even from turning his head at the soundless opening and closing of the door. He lay fully conscious that he was not alone, that quiet eyes had him steadily in regard. but like rats, his wits were beginning to busy themselves again. Sheer relief from the terrors of sleep, shame of his extremity and weakness, a festering sense of humiliation. Yes, he must save his face at all costs. He must put this preposterous spying valet in his place. Oddly enough, too, out of the deeps, a peculiar little vision of recollection had inexplicably obtruded itself into consciousness. It would be a witticism of the first water. "They are dreadfully out of season, you know," he began murmuring affectedly into the hush. "Dreadfully. But what I'm really pining for is a bunch of primroses. A primrose by the river's brim. Must be a little conservative." His voice was once more trailing off into a maudlin drowsiness. With an effort he roused himself, and now, with an extremely sharp twist of his head, he turned to confront his visitor. But the room was already vacant, the door ajar, and Jimmy's lids were on the point of closing again, sliding down over his tired eyes like leaden shutters which no power on earth could hinder or restrain, when at the faintest far whisper of sound they swept back suddenly, and almost incredibly wide, to drink in all they could of the spectacle of a small, odd-looking child who at the moment had embodied herself in the doorway. She seemed to have not the least intention of returning the compliment. Her whole gaze, from out of her fair, flaxen, pigtailed face, was fixed on the coarse blue-banded kitchen bowl which she was carrying with extreme care and caution in her two narrow hands. The idiots down below had evidently filled it too full of water, for the pale, wide-petalled flowers and thick crinkled leaves it contained were floating buoyantly nid-nod to and fro as she moved, pushing on each slippered foot in turn in front of the other, her whole mind concentrated on her task. A plain child, but extraordinarily fair as the primroses themselves in the congregation of candlelight that motionlessly flooded the room. A narrow-chested, long-chinned little creature who had evidently outgrown her strength. Jimmy was well accustomed to take things as they come, and his brief sojourn in his uncle's house in his present state of health had already enlarged the confines of the term thing. Anyhow, she was a relief from the valet. He found himself then watching this new visitor without the least trace of astonishment or even of surprise. And as his dark eyes coursed over the child, he simply couldn't decide whether she most closely took after Soames Jr. or Mrs. Thrips. All he could positively assure himself of was just the look, the family likeness, and that in itself was a queerish coincidence, since whatever your views might be regarding Soames Jr., Mrs. Thrips was real enough, as real at any rate as her scrubbing brush and her wholesome, evil-smelling soap. As a matter of fact, Jimmy was taking a very tight hold of himself. His mind might fancifully be compared to a quiet green swarming valley between steep rock-bound hills in which a violent battle was proceeding, standards and horsemen and smoke and terror and violence, but no sound. Deep down somewhere, he really wanted to be nice to the child. She meant no ill. She was a demure, far-away, harmless-looking creature. Ages ago, on the other hand, he wished to heaven they would leave him alone. They were pestering him. He knew perfectly well how far he was gone, and bitterly resented this renewed interference. And if there was one thing he detested, it was being made to look silly. "I hope you are trying to be a good little boy. You have not been talking to the servants," that kind of thing. It was therefore with mixed feelings and with a tinge of shamefacedness that he heard his own sneering, toneless voice insinuate itself into the silence. "And what, Missykins, can I do for you? What, you will understand, not how." The sneer had degenerated into a snarl. The child at this had not perceptibly faltered. Her face had seemed to lengthen a little, but that might have been due solely to her efforts to deliver her bowl without spilling its contents. Indeed, she actually succeeded in doing so, almost before Jimmy had had time to withdraw abruptly from the little gilt-railed table on which she deposited the clumsy pot. Frock, pigtail, red hands, she seemed to be as real a fellow creature as you might wish to see, but Jimmy stared quizzically on. Unfortunately, primroses have no scent, so that he could not call on his nose to bear witness to his eyes, and the congested conflict in the Green Valley was still proceeding. The child had paused. Her hands hung down now as if they were accustomed to service, and her pale blue eyes were fixed on his face in that exasperating manner which suggests that the owner of them is otherwise engaged. Not that she was looking through him. Even the sharpest of his female friends had never been able to boast of that little accomplishment. She was looking into him, as if he occupied time rather than space. Or was she, sneered that weary inward voice again, was she merely waiting for a tip? Look here, said Jimmy, dexterously raising himself to his elbow on the immense lace-fringed pillow. It's all very well. You have managed things quite admirably, considering your age and the season and so on. But I didn't ask for primroses, I asked for violets. That's a very old trick, a very old trick. For one further instant, dark and fair, crafty and simpleton-faced communed each with each other. But the smile on the one had fainted into a profound, childlike contemplation. And then, so swift and imperceptible had been his visitant's evanishment out of the room, that the very space she had occupied seemed to remain for a while outlined in the air, a nebulous shell of vacancy. She must apparently have glided backwards through the doorway, for Jimmy had assuredly not been conscious of the remotest glimpse of her pigtail from behind. Instantly on that, the stony hillside within had resounded with a furious clangour, cries and shouts and screamings, and Jimmy, his face bloodless with rage, his eyes almost blind with it, had leaped out of the great bed as if in murderous pursuit. There must, however, been an unusual degree or so of fever in his veins that night, so swift was his reaction. For the moment he was on his feet, an almost unendurable self-pity had swept into possession of him. To take a poor devil as literally as that, to catch him off his guard, not to give him the mere fleck of an opportunity to get his balance, to explain, to answer back, curse the primroses. But there was no time to lose. With one hand clutching his pyjamas, the other carrying the bowl, he poked forward out of the flare of the room into the cold lightlessness of the wide stone staircase. "Look here," he called down in a low, argumentative voice. "Look here, you can cheat and you can cheat, but to half strangle a fellow in his sleep and then send him up the snuffling caretaker's daughter, no, no, next time, you old make-believe. We'd prefer company a little more congenial." He swayed slightly, grimacing vacantly into the darkness and listening to his speech as dimly as might a somnambulist to the distant roar of falling water. And then, poor benighted creature, Jimmy tried to spit, but his lips and tongue were dry, and that particular insult was spared him. He had stooped laboriously, had put down the earthenware bowl on the Persian mat at the head of the staircase, and was self-congratulatorily re-welcoming himself into the scene of still lustre he had dared for that protracted minute to abandon, when he heard, as if from beneath and behind him, a kind of lolloping disquietude, and the sound of a clumsy clawed but persistent animal pushing its uncustomary awkward way up the soap-polished marble staircase. It was to be tit for tat, then. The miserable menage had let loose its menagerie. That they were going to experiment with the mouse cupboard and keyhole trickery of his childhood. Jimmy was violently shivering. His very toes were clinging to the mat on which he stood. Swaying a little and casting at the same time a strained, whitened glance round the room in which every object rested in the light, as if so it had rested from all eternity, he stood mutely and ghastly, listening. Even a large bedroom, 5 times the size of a small boy's attic, affords little scope for a fugitive, and shutting your eyes, darkening your outward face, is no escape. It had been a silly boast, he agreed, that challenge, that dare on the staircase, the boast of an idiot, for the congenial company that had now managed to hoof and scrabble its way up the slippery marble staircase was already on the threshold. All was utterly silent now. There was no obvious manifestation of danger. What was peering steadily in upon him out of the obscurity beyond the door was merely a blurred, whitish, beast-like shape, with still, passive, almost stagnant eyes, and its immense fixed face. A perfectly ludicrous object on paper, yet a creature so nauseous to soul and body, and with so obscene a greed in its motionless pig-like grin, that with one vertiginous swirl Jimmy's candles had swept up in his hand like a lateral race of streaming planets into the outer darkness. If his wet, groping fingers had not then encountered one of the carved pedestals of his uncle's bedstead, Jimmy would have fallen. Jimmy would have found, in fact, the thing's physical level. Try as he might, he had never in the days that followed made quite clear in his mind why for the third time he had not made a desperate plunging clutch at the bell rope. The thing must have been Soames Junior's emissary, even if the bird-faced scullery maid with the primroses had not also been one of the staff. That he had desisted simply in case she should herself have answered his summons and so have encountered the spurious animal as she mounted the dark staircase seemed literally too good to be true. Not only was Jimmy no sentimentalist, but that particular kind of goodness, even in a state of mind perfectly calm and collected, was not one of his pleasanter characteristics. Yet facts are facts, even comforting ones, and unless his memory was utterly untrustworthy, he had somehow contrived to regain his physical balance. Candelabrum in hand, he had actually indeed at last emerged from the room and stooped his dark head over the balusters in search of what unaccountably had not awaited his nearer acquaintance, and he must have flung the substantial little blue-banded slop basin, primroses and all, clean straight down in the direction of any kind of sentient target that happened to be in its way. "You must understand, Mrs. Thrips," he had afterwards solemnly explained, "I don't care to be disturbed, and particularly at night. All litter should of course be immediately cleared away. That's merely as things go in a well-regulated household, as in fact they do go. And I see you have replaced the one or two little specimens I was looking over out of the cabinet on the staircase. Pretty things too, though you hadn't the advantage of being in the service of their late owner, my uncle, as I was. Of course, 2 breakages cannot be avoided. There, I assure you, you are absolutely free. Moth and rust, Mrs. Thrips. No, all that I was merely inquiring about at the moment is that particular pot. There was an accident last night, primroses and so on, and one might have expected, one might have almost have sworn, Mrs. Thrips, that at least a shard or 2, as the psalmist says, would have been pretty conspicuous, even if the water had completely dried away. Not that I heard the smash, mind, I don't go as far as to say that, nor am I making any insinuations whatever. You are the best of creatures, you are indeed. And it's no good looking at me like Patience on a monument, because at present life is real and life is earnest. All I mean is that if one for a single moment ceases to guide one's conduct on reasonable lines, well, one comes to a perfectly indescribable cropper, Mrs. Thrips, like the pot." Mrs. Thrips' grey, untidy head had remained oddly stuck out from her body throughout this harangue. "No, sir," she repeated once more. "High and low, I've searched the house down. There isn't a shadder of what you might be referring to, not a shadder. And once more, I ask you, sir, let me call in Dr. Stokes. He's a very nice gentleman, and one as keeps as should be kept as close to himself as it being his duty he sees right and proper to do. Chasing and racketing of yourself up and down these runs of naked stairs in the dead of night is no proper place for you, sir, in your state. And I don't like to take responsibility. It's first the candles, then the bells, and then the kitchen, and then the basin. I know what I'm talking about, sir, having lost 2, and one at sea. And suppose, my dear, Jimmy had almost as brilliantly as ever smiled. Suppose we are all of us at sea. What then?" "Why then, sir," Mrs. Thrips had courageously retorted, "I'd as lief be at the bottom of it. There has been as much worry and trouble and making 2 ends meet in my life not to make the getting out of it of what you'd stand no ceremony for. I say it with all decent respect for what's respectful and proper, sir, but there isn't a morning I step down those area steps but my heart's in my mouth for fear, but there won't be anything in the house but what can't answer back. It's been a struggle to keep on, sir, and you as generous a gentleman as need be. If only you'd remain warm and natural in your bed when once there." A little inward trickle of laughter had entertained Jimmy as he watched the shapeless, patient old mouth utter these last few words. "That's just it, Mrs. Thrips," he had replied softly. "You've done for me far more effectively than anyone I care to remember in my insignificant little lifetime. You have indeed." Jimmy had even touched the hand bent like the claw of a bird around the broom handle. "In fact, you know, and I'm bound to confess it as gratefully as need be, they are all of them doing for me as fast as they can. I don't complain, not the least little bit in the world. All that I might be asking is, how the devil, to put it politely, how the goodness gracious is one to tell which is which? In my particular case, it seems to be the miller that sets the wind, not, of course, that he's got any particular grain to grind, not even wild oats. You funny old mother of a youthful mariner. No, no, no. Even the fact that there wasn't perhaps any pot after all, you'll understand, doesn't positively prove that neither could there have been any primroses. And before next January is 4 months old, we shall be at the end of yet another April. At least, and a sort of almost bluish pallor had spread like a shadow over his face, at least you will be. All of which is only to say, dear madam, as Beaconsfield remarked to old Vic, that I am thanking you now. At which Mrs. Thrips immediately fell upon her knees on her housemaid's pad and plunged her hands into her zinc pail, only instantly after to sit back on her heels, skinny hands on canvas apron. All I say, sir, is we go as we go, and a nicer gentleman taking things on the surface I never worked for. But one don't want to move too much in the public eye, sir. Of all the houses below stairs I've worked for and all alone in, I don't want a chance on a more private, in a manner of speaking, than this. All that I was saying, sir, and I wouldn't to none but you, is that life's getting on my nerves. When that door there closes after me, and every day drawing out steady as you can see without so much as glancing at the clock, I say to myself, well, better that poor young gentleman alone up there at night, coughing all, than me. I wouldn't sleep in this house, sir, not if you was to offer me a plate full of sovereigns, unless, sir, you wanted me. On reflection, Jimmy decided that he had cut almost a gallant figure as he'd retorted gaily, yet with extraordinary sobriety, you shall have a whole dishful before I'm done, Mrs. Thrips, with a big scoop in it for the gravy, but on my oath, I assure you there's absolutely nothing or nobody in this old barn of a museum except you and me. Nobody, unless, of course, you will understand one happened to pull the bell. And that we're not likely to do in broad daylight, are we, Mrs. Thrips? Upon which he had hastily caught up his aunt's handbag and had emerged into a daylight a good deal bleaker, if not broader, than he could gratefully stomach. For a while Jimmy had let well alone. Indeed, if it had been a mere matter of choice, he would far rather have engaged in a friendly and jocular conversation of this description with his old charwoman than in the endless monologues in which he found himself submerged on other occasions. One later afternoon, for instance, at 3:30 by his watch, sitting there by a small fire in the large muffled drawing-room, he at length came definitely to the conclusion that some kind of finality should be reached in his relations with the night staff in his Uncle Timothy's. It was pretty certain that his visit would soon be drawing to a close. Staying out at night until he was almost too exhausted to climb down to the pavement from his hansom, the first April silver of dawn warning the stark and empty chimney pots, had proved a dull and tedious alternative. The mere spectator of gaiety, he concluded, as he stared at the immense picture of the Colosseum on his Uncle Timothy's wall, may have as boring a time as must the slaves who cleaned out the cages of the lions that ate the Christians, and snapping out insults at former old cronies who couldn't help their faces being as tiresome as a whitewashed pigsty, had soon grown wearisome. Jimmy, of course, was accustomed to taking no interest in things which did not interest him, but quite respectable people could manage that equally well. What fretted him almost beyond endurance was an increasing inability to keep his attention fixed on what was really there, what at least all such respectable people, one might suppose, would unanimously agree was there. A moment's fixture of the eyes, and he would find himself steadily listening, now in a creeping dread that somewhere, down below, there was a good deal that needed an almost constant attention, and now in sudden alarm that after all there was absolutely nothing. Again and again in recollection he had hung over the unlighted staircase, listening in an extremity of foreboding from the outbreak of rabbit-like childish squeal of terror which could have proved, well, what would it have proved? My God, what a world! You can prove nothing. The fact that he was all but certain that any such intolerably helpless squeal never had wailed up to him out of its pit of blackness could be only a partial consolation. He hadn't meant to be a beast. It was only his facetious little way, and you would have to be something pretty piggish in pigs to betray a child, however insubstantial, into the nausea and vertigo he had experienced in the presence of that unspeakable abortion. The whole thing had become a fatuous obsession. If, it appeared, you only remained solitary and secluded enough and let your mind wander on in its own sweet way, the problem was almost bound to become, if not your one and only, at least your chief concern. Unless you were preternaturally busy and preoccupied, you simply couldn't live on and on in a haunted house without being occasionally reminded of its ghosts. To dismiss the matter as pure illusion, The spectral picturing of life's fitful fever might be all very well. That is, if you had the blood of a fish. But who on earth had ever found the world a pleasanter and sweeter a place to bid goodbye to simply because it was obviously substantial, whatever that might mean? Simply because it did nothing you wanted it to do unless you paid for it pretty handsomely, or unless you accepted what it proffered with as open a hospitality as Jimmy had bestowed on his pilgrims of the night. Not that he much wanted, however pressing the invitation, to wander off out of his body into a better world, or for that matter, into a worse. Upstairs under the roof years ago, Jimmy, as a small boy, would rather have died of terror than meddle with the cord above his bed rail, simply because he knew that Soames Senior was at the other end of it. He had hated Soames, but had merely feared the nothings of his night hours. But suppose Soames had been a different kind of butler. There must be almost as many kinds as there are human beings. Suppose his Uncle Timothy and Aunt Charlotte had chosen theirs a little less idiosyncratically. What then? Well, anyhow, in a sense, he was not sorry life had been a little exciting these last few weeks. How odd that when all but jellied your soul in your body at night or in a dream might merely amuse you like a shilling shocker in the safety of day. The safety of day. At the very cadence of the words in his mind, as he sat there in his aunt's salon, his limbs huddled over Mrs. Thripps's fire, Jimmy's eyes had fixed themselves again. Again, he was listening. Was it that if you saw in your mind any distant room or place, that place must actually, at the moment, contain you, some self, some astral body? If so, wouldn't, of course, you hear yourself moving about in it? There was a slight whining wind in the street outside the rainy window that afternoon, and once more the bright idea crossed Jimmy's mind that he should steal upstairs before it was dark, mount up onto the Arabian bed and just cut the bell pull once and for all. But would that necessarily dismiss the staff? Necessarily. His eye wandered to the discreet S of yet another bell pull, that which graced the wall beneath the expansive white marble chimney-piece. He hesitated. There was no doubt his mind was now hopelessly jaundiced against all bell ropes, whether they failed to summon one to church or persisted in summoning one to a 6-foot hole in a cemetery. His Uncle Timothy lay in a mausoleum. On the other hand, he was properly convinced that a gentleman is as a gentleman does, and that it was really up to you to treat all bell answerers with decent courtesy, no matter who, when, where. A universal rule like that is a sheer godsend. If they didn't answer, well, you couldn't help yourself, or rather, you'd have to. This shivering was merely physical. When a fellow is so thin that he can almost hear his ribs grind one against the other when he stoops to pick up a poker, such symptoms must be expected. There was still an hour or two of daylight, even though clouds admitted only a greyish light upon the world, and his Uncle Timothy's house was by nature friendly to gloom. That house at this moment seemed to hang domed upon his shoulders like an immense, imponderable shell. The flames in the chimney whispered, fluttered, hovered, like fitfully playing once happy birds. Supposing if, even against his better judgment, he leaned forward now in his chair, and what was infinitely more conventional and in a sense more proper than summoning unforeseen entities to one's bedside, supposing he gave just one discreet little tug at that small porcelain knob. What would he ask for? He need ask nothing. He could act. Yes, if he could be perfectly sure that some monstrous porcine cacodemon akin to the shapes of childish nightmare would come hoofing up out of the deeps at his behest, well, he would chance it. He would have it out with the brute. It was still day. It was still day. But maybe the ear of pleasanter visitors might catch the muffled tinkle. In the young man's mind there was now no vestige of jocularity. In an instant's lightness of heart he had once thought of purchasing from the stiff-aproned old assistant at his Aunt Charlotte's family grocer's a thumping big box of chocolates. Why, just that one small bowl in famille rose up there couldn't be bartered for the prettiest little necklet of seed pearls. She had done her best with her skimpy shoulders, skimpier pigtail and soda-reddened hands. Pigtail! But no, you might pull real bells to pull dubiously genuine pigtails seemed now a feeble jest. The old Jimmy of that kind of facetiousness was a thing of the past. Apart from pigs and tweeny maids, what other peculiar emanations might in the future respond to his summonings, Jimmy's exhausted imagination could only faintly prefigure. For a few minutes, a modern St. Anthony sat there in solitude in the vast half-blinded London drawing-room, while shapes and images and apparitions of memory and fantasy sprang into thin being and passed away in his mind. No, no. Do to the book, quench the candles, ring the bell. Amen. Amen. He was done with all that. Maledictions and anathemas. They only tangled the hank. So when at last his meagre, stooping body, mutely placed only by the flame light, he jerked round his narrow head to glance at the distant mirror, it must have been on the mere after-image, so to speak, of the once quite substantial-looking tweeny maid that his exhausted eyes thirstily fixed themselves. She was there, over there, where Soames Jr. had more than once taken up his obsequious station. She was smiling, if the dusk of the room could be trusted that far, and not through, but really at Jimmy. She was fairer than ever, fairer than the flaxenest of nymphs on his uncle's ceiling, fairer than the saffronest of young ladies in the respectablest of family grocers, fairer even than... Jimmy hung on this simple vision as did Dives on the spectacle of Lazarus in bliss. At once, of course, after his very first sigh of relief and welcome, he had turned back on his lips a glib little speech suggesting forgiveness. Let old acquaintance be forgot, that kind of thing. He was too tired even to be clever now, and the oddest of convictions had at once come into his mind, seemed almost to fill his body even, that she was waiting for something else. Yes, she was smiling as if in hope. She was waiting to be told to go. Jimmy was no father. He didn't want to be considerate of the raw little creature, to cling to her company, but for a few minutes longer, with a view to returns in kind. No, nothing at all of that. Oh, my God, a voice groaned within him, but not at any unprecedented jag or stab of pain. The child was still waiting, quite quietly there, as if a shadow, as if a secret and obscure ray of light, and it seemed to Jimmy that in its patient face hung veil upon veil of uncountable faces of the past, in paint, stone, actuality, dream, that he had glanced at or brooded on in the enormous history of his life, that he may have coveted too, and as well as his rebellious features could and would, he smiled back at her. I understand, my dear, he drew back his dry lips to explain. Perfectly. And it was courtesy itself of you to look in when I didn't ring. I didn't. I absolutely put my tongue out at the grinning old knob, but no more of that. One mustn't talk for talking's sake. Else why all those old Trappists, though none of 'em so much as a bag of bones as me, I bet, but without jesting, you know. Once more, a distant voice within spoke in Jimmy's ear. It's important, it said. You really must hold your tongue until, well, it holds itself. But Jimmy's face continued to smile. And then, suddenly, every vestige of amusement abandoned it. He stared baldly, almost emptily at the faint inmate of his solitude. All that I have to say, he muttered, is just this. I have Mrs. Thrips. I haven't absolutely cut the wire. I wish to be alone, but if I ring, I'm not asking, you see. In time, I may be able to know what I want. But what is important now is that no more than that accursed pig with your primrose is real, my dear. You see, things must be real. And now, I suppose, he had begun shivering again, you must go. You must go. But listen. We part friends. The coals in the grate, with a scarcely audible shuffling, recomposed themselves to their consuming. When there hasn't been anything there, nothing can be said to have vanished from the place where it has not been. Still, Jimmy had felt infinitely colder and immeasurably lonelier when his mouth had thus fallen to silence, and he was so empty and completely exhausted that his one apprehension had been lest he should be unable to ascend the staircase to get to bed. There was no doubt of it. His ultimatum had been instantly effective. The whole house was now preternaturally empty. It was needless even to listen to prove that. So absolute was its pervasive quietude that when at last he gathered his bones together in the effort to rise, to judge from the withering colour of the cinders and ashes in the fireplace, he must have been for some hours asleep, and daybreak must be near. He managed the feat at last, gathered up the tartan travelling shawl that had tented in his scarecrow knees, and lit the only candle in its crystal stick in his Aunt Charlotte's drawing room. And it was an almost quixotically peaceful though forebodeful Jimmy, who step by step, the fountain of his thoughts completely stilled, his night mind as clear and sparkling as a cavern bedangled with stalagmites and stalactites, climbed laboriously on and up from wide shallow marble stair to stair. He paused in the corridor above, but the nymphs within, muses, graces, fates, what not, piped in vain their mute decoy. His Uncle Timothy's Arabian bed in vain summoned him to its downy embraces. At the wide open door he brandished his guttering candle in a last smiling gesture of farewell, and held on. That is why, when next morning, out of a sounding, slanting shower of rain, Mrs. Thrips admitted herself into the house at the area door, she found the young man, still in his clothes, lying very fast asleep indeed on the truckle bed in the attic. His hands were not only crossed, but convulsively clenched in that position on his breast, and it appeared from certain distressing indications that he must have experienced a severe struggle to refrain from a wild, blind tug at the looped-up length of knotted whipcord above his head. As a matter of fact, it did not occur to the littered old charwoman's mind to speculate whether or not Jimmy had actually made such a last attempt, or whether he had been content merely to wait on a Soames who might perhaps, like all good servants, come when he was wanted, rather than when he was called. All her own small knowledge of Soameses, though not without comfort, had been acquired at second hand. Nor did Mrs. Thrips waste time in surmising how Jimmy could ever have persuaded himself to loop up the cord like that out of his reach, unless he had first become abysmally ill-content with his small, primitive, and belated knowledge of campanology. She merely looked at what was left of him, her old face almost comically transfixed in its appearance of pity, horror, astonishment, and curiosity.
The Open Door by Charlotte Riddell. Some people do not believe in ghosts. For that matter, some people do not believe in anything. There are persons who even affect incredulity concerning that open door at Ladlow Hall. They say it did not stand wide open, that they could have shut it, that the whole affair was a delusion, that they are sure it must have been a conspiracy, that they are doubtful whether there is such a place as Ladlow on the face of the earth, that the first time they're in Meadowshire, they will look it up. That is the manner in which this story, hitherto unpublished, has been greeted by my acquaintances. How it will be received by strangers is quite another matter. I'm going to tell what happened to me exactly as it happened, and readers can credit or scoff at the tale as it pleases them. It is not necessary for me to find faith and comprehension in addition to a ghost story for the world at large. If such were the case, I should lay down my pen. Perhaps, before going further, I ought to premise there was a time when I did not believe in ghosts either. If you had asked me one summer's morning years ago when you met me on London Bridge if I held such appearances to be probable or possible, you would have received an emphatic no for answer. But at this rate, the story of the open door will never be told, so we will, with your permission, plunge into it immediately. Sandy, what do you want? Should you like to earn a sovereign? Of course I should. A somewhat curt dialogue, but we were given to curtness in the office of Messrs. Frimpton, Frampton and Fryer, auctioneers and estate agents, St. Bennet's Hill, City. My name is not Sandy or anything like it, but the other clerks so styled me because of the real or fancied likeness to some character, an ill-looking Scotchman they had seen at the theatre. From this it may be inferred I was not handsome, far from it, the only ugly specimen in my family. I knew I was very plain, and it chanced to be no secret to me either that I felt grievously discontented with my lot. I did not like my occupation of clerk in an auctioneer's office, and I did not like my employers. We are all of us inconsistent, I suppose, for it was a shock to me to find they entertained the most cordial antipathy to me. Because, went on Patron, a fellow my senior by many years, a fellow who delighted in chaffing me, I can tell you how to lay hands on one. How? I asked, sulkily enough, for I felt he was having what he called his fun. You know that place we let to Carrison, the tea dealer? Carrison was a merchant in the China trade, possessed of fleets of vessels and towns of warehouses. But I did not correct Patron's expression, I simply nodded. He took it on as a long lease, and he can't live in it. And our governor said this morning he wouldn't mind giving anybody who could find out what the deuce is the matter a couple of sovereigns and his travelling expenses. Where is the place? I asked without turning my head. For the convenience of listening, I had put my elbows on the desk and propped up my face with both hands. Away down in Meadowshire, in the heart of the grazing country. And what is the matter? I further inquired. A door, and it won't keep shut. What? A door that will keep open, if you prefer that way of putting it, said Patron. You are jesting. If I am, Carrison is not, or Fryer either. Carrison came here in a nice passion, and Fryer was in a fine rage. I could see he was, though he kept his temper outwardly. They've had an active correspondence, it appears, and Carrison went away to talk to his lawyer. We won't make much by that move, I fancy. But tell me, I entreated, why the door won't keep shut. They say the place is haunted. What nonsense, I exclaimed. Then you are just the person to take the ghost in hand. I thought so, while old Fryer was speaking. If the door won't shut, I remarked, pursuing my own train of thought, why can't they let it stay open? I have not the slightest idea. I only know there are 2 sovereigns to be made, and that I give you a present of the information. And having thus spoken, Patron took down his hat and went out, either upon his own business or that of his employers. There was one thing I can truly say about our office. We were never serious in it. I fancy that is the case in most offices nowadays. At all events, it was the case in ours. We were always chaffing each other, playing practical jokes, telling stupid stories, scamping our work, looking at the clock, counting the weeks to next St. Lubbock's Day, counting the hours to Saturday. For all that, we were all very earnest in our desire to have our salaries raised, and unanimous in the opinion no fellows ever before received such wretched pay. I had £20 a year, which I was aware did not half. My mother and sisters left me in no doubt on the point, and when new clothes were wanted, I always hated to mention the fact to my poor worried father. We had been better off once, I believe, though I never remembered the time. My father owned a small property in the country, but owing to the failure of some bank, I never could understand what bank, it had to be mortgaged. Then the interest was not paid, and the mortgages foreclosed, and we had nothing left save the half pay of a major, and about 100 a year, which my mother brought to the common fund. We might have managed on our income, I think, if we had not been so painfully genteel, but we were always trying to do something quite beyond our means, and consequently debts accumulated, and creditors ruled us with rods of iron. Before the final smash came, one of my sisters married the younger son of a distinguished family, and even if they had been disposed to live comfortably and sensibly, she would have kept her sisters up to the mark. My only brother, too, was an officer, and of course the family thought it necessary he should see we preserved appearances. It was all a great trial to my father, I think, who had to bear the brunt of the dunning and harass and eternal shortages of money, and it would have driven me crazy if I had not found a happy refuge when matters were going wrong at home at my aunt's. She was my father's sister, and had married so dreadfully below her that my mother refused to acknowledge the relationship at all. For these reasons and others, Patron's careless words about the 2 sovereigns stayed in my memory. I wanted money badly. I may say I never had 6pence in the world of my own, and I thought if I could earn 2 sovereigns I might buy some trifles I needed for myself, and present my father with a new umbrella. Fancy is a dangerous little jade to flirt with, as I soon discovered. She led me on and on. First, I thought of the 2 sovereigns. Then I recalled the amount of the rent Mr. Carrison agreed to pay for Ladlow Hall. Then I decided he would gladly give more than 2 sovereigns if he could only have the ghost turned out of possession. I fancied I might get £10, £20. I considered the matter all day, and I dreamed of it all night. And when I dressed myself next morning, I was determined to speak to Mr. Fryer on the subject. I did so. I told that gentleman Patron had mentioned the matter to me, and that if Mr. Fryer had no objection, I would like to try whether I could not solve the mystery. I told him I had been accustomed to lonely houses, and that I should not feel at all nervous, that I did not believe in ghosts, and as for burglars, I was not afraid of them. "I don't mind your trying," he said at last. "Of course you understand it is no cure, no pay. Stay in the house for a week. If at the end of that time you can keep the door shut, locked, bolted, or nailed up, telegraph for me, and I will go down. If not, come back. If you like to take a companion, there is no objection." I thanked him, but said I would rather not have a companion. "There is only one thing, sir, I should like," I ventured. "And that," he interrupted, "is a little more money. If I lay the ghost, or find out the ghost, I think I ought to have more than 2 sovereigns." "How much more do you think you ought to have?" he asked. His tone quite threw me off guard. It was so civil and conciliatory, and I answered boldly, "Well, if Mr. Carrison cannot now live in the place, perhaps he wouldn't mind giving me a £10 note." Mr. Fryer turned and opened one of the books lying on his desk. He did not look at it or refer to it in any way. I saw that. "You have been with us now how long, Idlid?" he said. 11 months tomorrow, I replied. "And our arrangement was, I think, quarterly payments, at 1 month's notice on either side." "Yes, sir." I heard my voice tremble, though I could not have said what frightened me. "Then you will please take your notice now. Come in before you leave this evening, and I'll pay you 3 months' salary, and then we shall be quits." "I don't think I quite understand," I was beginning, when he broke in. "But I understand, and that's enough. I have had enough of you and your airs and your indifference and your insolence here. I never had a clerk I disliked as I do you, coming and dictating terms, forsooth. No, you shan't go to Ladlow. Many a poor chap," he said, devil, "would have been glad to earn half a guinea, let alone 2 sovereigns, and perhaps you may be before you're much older." "Do you mean that you won't keep me here any longer, sir?" I asked in despair. "I had no intention of offending you. "Now, you need not say another word," he interrupted, "for I won't bandy words with you. Since you have been in this place, you have never known your position, and you don't seem to be able to realize it. When I was foolish enough to take you, I did it on the strength of your connections, but your connections have done nothing for me. I have never had a penny out of any one of your friends, if you have any. You'll not do any good in business for yourself or anybody else, and sooner you go off to Australia," here he was very emphatic, "and get off these premises, the better I shall be pleased." I did not answer him. I could not. He had worked himself into a white heat by this time, and evidently intended I should leave his premises there and then. He counted £5 out of his cash box, and writing a receipt, pushed it and the money across the table, and bade me sign and be off at once. My hand trembled. I could scarcely hold the pen, but I had presence of mind enough left to return £1.10 in gold, and 3 shillings and 4pence I had, quite by the merest good fortune, in my waistcoat pocket. "I can't take wages for work I haven't done," I said, as well as sorrow and passion would let me. "Good morning," and I left his office and passed out among the clerks. I took from my desk the few articles belonging to me, left the papers it contained in order, and then, locking it, asked Patron if he would be so good as give the key to Mr. Fryer. "What's up?" he asked. "Are you going?" I said. "Yes, I am going." "Got the sack?" "That is exactly what has happened." "Well, exclaimed Mr. Patron. I did not stop to hear any further commentary on the matter, but bidding my fellow clerks goodbye, shook the dust of Frimpton's estate and agency office from off my feet. I did not like to go home and say I was discharged, so I walked about aimlessly, and at length found myself in Regent Street. There I met my father, looking more worried than usual. "Do you think, Phil," he said, "my name's Theophilus, you could get £2 or £3 for your employers?" Maintaining a discreet silence regarding what had passed, I answered, "No doubt I could." "I should be glad if you will then, my boy," he went, "for we are badly in want of it." I did not ask him what was the special trouble. Where would have been the use? There was always something, gas or water, or poor rates, or the butcher, or the baker, or the bootmaker. Well, it didn't much matter, for we were well accustomed to the life, but I thought, if I ever marry, we will keep within our means. And then there rose up before me a vision of Patty, my cousin, the blithest, prettiest, most useful, most sensible girl that ever made sunshine in a poor man's house. My father and I had parted by this time, and I was still walking aimlessly on, when all at once an idea occurred to me. Mr. Fryer had not treated me well or fairly. I would hoist him by his own petard. I would go to headquarters and try to make terms with Mr. Carrison direct. No sooner thought than done. I hailed a passing omnibus, and was ere long in the heart of the city. Like other great men, Mr. Carrison was difficult of access, indeed so difficult of access that the clerk to whom I applied for an audience told me plainly I could not see him at all. I might send him my message if I liked, he was good enough to add, and no doubt it would be attended to. I said I should not send in a message, and was then asked what I would do. My answer was simple. I meant to wait till I did see him. I was told they could not have people waiting about in the office in this way. I said I supposed I might stay in the street. Carrison didn't own that, I suggested. The clerk advised me not to try that game, or I might get locked up. I said I would take my chance of it. After that, we went on arguing the question at some length, and we were in the middle of a heated argument, in which several of Carrison's young gentlemen, as they called themselves, were good enough to join, when we were all suddenly silenced by a grave-looking individual who authoritatively inquired, "What's all this noise about?" Before anyone could answer, I spoke up. "I want to see Mr. Carrison, and they won't let me in." "What do you want with Mr. Carrison?" "I will tell that to himself only." "Very well, say on. I am Mr. Carrison." For a moment I felt abashed and almost ashamed of my persistency. Next instant, however, what Mr. Fryer would have called my native audacity came to the rescue, and I said, drawing a step or two nearer to him and taking off my hat, "I wanted to speak to you about Ladlow Hall, if you please, sir." In an instant, the fashion of his face changed. A look of irritation succeeded to that of immobility. An angry contraction of the eyebrows disfigured the expression of his countenance. "Ladlow Hall," he repeated. "And what have you got to say about Ladlow Hall?" "That is what I wanted to tell you, sir," I answered, and a dead hush seemed to fall on the office as I spoke. The silence seemed to attract his attention, for he looked sternly at the clerks, who were not using a pen or moving a finger. "Come this way, then," he said abruptly, and the next minute I was in his private office. "Now, what is it?" he asked, flinging himself into a chair, and addressing me, who stood hat in hand beside the great table in the middle of the room. I began. I will say he was a patient listener at the very beginning, and told my story straight through. I concealed nothing, I enlarged on nothing. A discharged clerk, I stood before him, and in the capacity of a discharged clerk, I said what I had to say. He heard me to the end, and then he sat silent, thinking. At last he spoke. "You have heard a great deal of conversation about Ladlow, I suppose," he remarked. "No, sir, I have heard nothing except what I've told you." "And why do you desire to strive to solve such a mystery? If there is any money to be made, I should like to make it, sir." "How old are you?" 22 last January. "And how much salary had you at Frimpton's?" £20 a year. More than you're worth, I should say." "Mr. Fryer seemed to imagine so, sir, at any rate," I agreed, sorrowfully. "But what do you think?" he asked, smiling in spite of himself. "I think I did quite as much work as the other clerks," I answered. "That is not saying much, perhaps," he observed. I was of his opinion, but I held my peace. "You will never make much of a clerk, I'm afraid," Mr. Carrison proceeded, fitting his disparaging remarks upon me as he might on a lay figure. "You don't like desk work." "Not much, sir. I should judge the best thing you could do would be to emigrate," he went on, eyeing me critically. Mr. Fryer said I had better go to Australia or... I stopped, remembering the alternative that gentleman had presented. "Or where?" asked Mr. Carrison. "Sir," I explained softly and apologetically. He laughed. He lay back in his chair and laughed, and I laughed myself, though ruefully. After all, £20 was £20, though I had not thought much of the salary till I lost it. We went on talking for a long time after that. He asked me all about my father and my early life and how we lived and where we lived and the people we knew, and in fact put more questions than I can well remember. It seems like a crazy thing to do, he said at last, and yet I feel disposed to trust you. The house is standing perfectly empty. I can't live in it, and I can't get rid of it. All my own furniture I've removed, and there's nothing in the place except a few old-fashioned articles belonging to Lord Ladlow. The place is a loss to me. It is of no use trying to let it, and thus, in fact, matters are at a deadlock. You won't be able to find out anything, I know, because others have tried to solve this mystery ere now. Still, if you like to try, you may. I'll make this bargain with you. If you like to go down, I will pay your reasonable expenses for a fortnight. And if you do any good for me, I'll give you a £10 note for yourself. Of course, I must be satisfied that what you have told me is true, and that you are what you represent. Do you know anybody in the city who would speak for you? I could think of no one but my uncle. I hinted to Mr. Carrison he was not grand or rich enough, perhaps, but I knew no one else to whom I could refer him. What, he said, Robert Dorland of Cullen Street? He does business with us. If he will go bail for your good behaviour, I shan't want any further guarantee. Come along. And to my intense amazement, he rose, put on his hat, walked me across the outer office and along the pavements till we came to Cullen Street. Do you know this youth, Mr. Dorland? He said, standing in front of my uncle's desk and laying a hand on my shoulder. Of course I do, Mr. Carrison, answered my uncle, a little apprehensively, for, as he told me afterwards, he could not imagine what mischief I had been up to. He is my nephew. And what is your opinion of him? Do you think he's a young fellow I could safely trust? My uncle smiled and answered, That depends on what you wish to trust him with. A long column of addition, for instance. It would be safer to give that task to somebody else. Oh, uncle, I remonstrated, for I had really striven to conquer my natural antipathy to figures, worked hard, and every bit of it against the collar. My uncle got off his stool and said, standing with his back to the empty fire grate, Tell me what you wish the boy to do, Mr. Carrison, and I will tell you whether he'll suit your purpose or not. I know him, I believe, better than he knows himself. In an easy, affable way for so rich a man, Mr. Carrison took possession of the vacant stool, and nursing his right leg over his left knee, answered, He wants to go and shut the open door at Ladlow Hall for me. Do you think he can do that? My uncle looked steadily back at the speaker and said, I thought, Mr. Carrison, it was quite settled. No one could shut it. Mr. Carrison shifted a little uneasily on his seat and replied, I did not set your nephew the task he fancies he would like to undertake. I did not set your nephew the task he fancies he would like to undertake. Have nothing to do with it, Phil, advised my uncle shortly. You don't believe in ghosts, do you, Mr. Dorland? Asked Mr. Carrison with a slight sneer. Don't you, Mr. Carrison? Retorted my uncle. There was a pause, an uncomfortable pause, during the course of which I felt the £10, which in imagination I had really spent, trembling in the scale. I was not afraid. For £10, or half the money, I would have faced all the inhabitants of Spiritland. I longed to tell them so, but something in the way these two men looked at each other stayed my tongue. If you ask me the question here in the heart of the city, Mr. Dorland, said Mr. Carrison at length, slowly and carefully, I answer no. But if you were to put me on a dark night at Ladlow, I should beg time to consider. I do not believe in supernatural phenomena myself, and yet the door at Ladlow is as much beyond my comprehension as the ebbing and flowing of the sea. And you can't live at Ladlow, remarked my uncle. I can't live at Ladlow, and what is more, I can't get anyone else to live at Ladlow. And you want to get rid of your lease. I want so much to get rid of my lease that I told Fryer I would give him a handsome sum if he could induce anyone to solve the mystery. Is there any other information you desire, Mr. Dorland? Because if there is, you have only to ask, and have it. I feel I am not here in a prosaic office in the City of London, but in the Palace of Truth. My uncle took no notice of the implied compliment. When wine is good, it needs no bush. If a man is habitually honest in his speech and in his thoughts, he desires no recognition of the fact. I don't think so, he answered. It is for the boy to say what he will do. If he be advised by me, he will stick to his ordinary work in his employer's office and leave ghost hunting and spirit-laying alone. Mr. Carrison shot a rapid glance in my direction, a glance which, implying a secret understanding, might have influenced my uncle could I have stooped to deceive my uncle. I can't stick to my work there any longer, I said. I got my marching orders today. What have you been doing, Phil? Asked my uncle. I wanted £10 to go and lay the ghost, I answered, so dejectedly that both Mr. Carrison and my uncle broke out laughing. £10, cried my uncle, almost between laughing and crying. Well, Phil, boy, I had rather, poor man though I am, have given 3 £10 than that thou shouldst go ghost hunting or ghost laying. When he was very much in earnest, my uncle went back to thee and thou of his native dialect. I liked the vulgarism, as my mother called it, and I knew my aunt loved to hear him use the caressing words to her. He had risen, not quite from the ranks, it's true, but if ever a gentleman came ready-born into the world, it was Robert Dorland, upon whom, at our home, everyone seemed to look down. "What will you do, Edlyd?" asked Mr. Carrison. "You hear what your uncle says. Give up the enterprise, and what I say, I do not want either to bribe or force your inclinations." "I will go, sir," I answered quite steadily. "I'm not afraid, and I would like to show you—" I stopped. I had been going to say, "I should like to show you that I am not such a fool as you all take me for," but I felt such an address would be too familiar, and refrained. Mr. Carrison looked at me curiously. I think he supplied the end of the sentence for himself, but he only answered, "I should like you to show me that door fast shut. At any rate, if you can stay in the place alone for a fortnight, you shall have your money." "I don't like it, Phil," said my uncle. "I don't like this freak at all." "I'm sorry for that, uncle," I answered, "for I mean to go." "When?" asked Mr. Carrison. "Tomorrow morning," I replied. "Give him £5, Dolan, please, and I'll send you my cheque. You'll account to me for that sum, you understand," added Mr. Carrison, turning to where I stood. "A sovereign will be quite enough," I said. "You'll take £5 and account to me for it," repeated Mr. Carrison firmly. "Also, you will write to me every day to my private address, and if at any moment you feel the thing too much for you, throw it up. Good afternoon." And without more formal leave-taking, he departed. "It's of no use talking to you, Phil, I suppose," said my uncle. "I don't think it is," I replied. "You won't say anything to them at home, will you?" "I'm not very likely to meet any of them, am I?" he answered without a shade of bitterness, merely stating a fact. "I suppose I shall not see you again before I start," I said, "so I will bid you goodbye now." "Goodbye, my lad. I wish I could see you a bit wiser and steadier." I didn't answer him. My heart was very full, and my eyes too. I had tried, but office work was not in me, and I felt it was just as vain to ask me to sit on a stool and pore over writing and figures as to think a person born destitute of musical ability could compose an opera. Of course, I went straight to Patty, though we were not then married, though sometimes it seemed to me as if we never should be married. She was my better half then, as she is my better half now. She didn't throw cold water on the project. She didn't discourage me. What she said, with her dear face aglow with excitement, was, "I only wish, Phil, I was going with you." Heaven knows, so did I. Next morning, I was up before the milkman. I had told my people overnight I should be going out of town on business. Patty and I settled the whole plan in detail. I was to breakfast and dress there, for I meant to go down to Ladlow in my volunteer garments. That was a subject upon which my poor father and I could never agree. He called volunteering child's play, and other things equally hard to bear, whilst my brother, a very carpet warrior to my mind, was never weary of ridiculing the force and chaffing me for imagining I was a soldier. Patty and I had talked matters over and settled, as I have said, that I should dress at her father's. A young fellow I knew had won a revolver at a raffle and willingly lent it to me. With that and my rifle, I felt I could conquer an army. It was a lovely afternoon when I found myself walking through leafy lanes in the heart of Meadowshire. With every vein of my heart, I loved the country, and the country was looking its best just then. Grass ripe for the mower, grain forming in the ear, rippling streams, dreamy rivers, old orchards, quaint cottages. Oh, that I had never to go back to London, I thought, for I am one of the few people left on earth who love the country and hate cities. I walked on. I walked a long way, and being uncertain as to my road, asked a gentleman who was slowly riding a powerful roan horse under arching trees, a gentleman accompanied by a young lady mounted on a stiff white pony, my way to Ladlow Hall. "That is Ladlow Hall," he answered, pointing with his whip over the fence to my left hand. I thanked him and was going on when he said, "No one's living there now." "I'm aware of that," I answered. He didn't say anything more, only courteously bade me good day, and rode off. The young lady inclined her head in acknowledgment of my uplifted cap, and smiled kindly. Altogether I felt pleased. Little things always did please me. It was a good beginning, halfway to a good ending. When I got to the lodge, I showed Mr. Carrison's letter to the woman and received the key. "You're not going to stop up at the hall alone, are you, sir?" she asked. Yes, I am, I answered uncompromisingly, so uncompromisingly that she said no more. The avenue led straight to the house. It was uphill all the way, and bordered by rows of the most magnificent limes I ever beheld. A light iron fence divided the avenue from the park, and between the trunks of the trees I could see the deer browsing and the cattle grazing. Ever and anon there came likewise to my ear the sound of a sheep bell. It was a long avenue, but at length I stood in front of the hall, a square, solid-looking, old-fashioned house, 3 stories high, with no basement. A flight of steps up to the principal entrance, 4 windows to the right of the door, 4 windows to the left, the whole building flanked and backed with trees, all the blinds pulled down, a dead silence brooding over the place, the sun westering behind the great trees studding the park. I took all this in as I approached, and afterwards, as I stood for a moment under the ample porch, then remembering the business which had brought me so far, I fitted the great key in the lock, turned the handle, and entered Ludlow Hall. For a minute, stepping out of the bright sunlight, the place looked to me so dark that I could scarcely distinguish the objects by which I was surrounded. But my eyes soon grew accustomed to the comparative darkness, and I found I was in an immense hall, lighted from the roof. A magnificent old oak staircase conducted to the upper rooms. The floor was of black and white marble. There were 2 fireplaces fitted with dogs for burning wood. Around the walls hung pictures, antlers and horns, and in odd niches and corners stood groups of statues and the figures of men in complete suits of armour. To look at the place outside, no one would have expected to find such a hall. I stood lost in amazement and admiration, and then I began to glance more particularly around. Mr. Carrison had not given me any instructions by which to identify the ghostly chamber, which I concluded would most probably be found on the 1st floor. I knew nothing of the story connected with it, if there were a story. On that point I had left London as badly provided with mental as with actual luggage, worse provided. Indeed, for a hamper, packed by Patty and a small bag were coming over from the station. But regarding the mystery, I was perfectly unencumbered. I had not the faintest idea in which apartment it resided. Well, I should discover that, no doubt, for myself, ere long. I looked around me, doors, doors, doors. I had never before seen so many doors all together at once. 2 of them stood open, one wide, the other slightly ajar. I'll just shut them as a beginning, I thought, before I go upstairs. The doors were of oak, heavy, well-fitting, furnished with good locks and sound handles. After I'd closed them, I tried them. Yes, they were quite secure. I ascended the great staircase, feeling curiously like an intruder, paced the corridors, entered the many bedchambers, some quite bare of furniture, others containing articles of an ancient fashion and no doubt of considerable value, chairs, antique dressing tables, curious wardrobes, and such like. For the most part, the doors were closed, and I shut those that stood open before making my way into the attics. I was greatly delighted with the attics. The windows lighting them did not, as a rule, overlook the front of the hall, but commanded wide views over wood and valley and meadow. Leaning out of one, I could see that to the right of the hall, the ground, thickly planted, shelved down to a stream, which came out into the daylight a little distance beyond the plantation, and meandered through the deer park. At the back of the hall, the windows looked out on nothing, save a dense wood and a portion of the stable yard, whilst on the side nearest the point from whence I had come, there were the spreading gardens surrounded by thick yew hedges, and kitchen gardens protected by high walls, and further on a farmyard, where I could perceive cows and oxen, and further still luxuriant meadows and fields glad with waving corn. "What a beautiful place," I said. Garrison must have been a duffer to leave it, and then I thought what a great ramshackle house it was for anyone to be all alone in. Getting heated with my long walk, I suppose, made me feel chilly, for I shivered as I drew my head in from the last dormer window and prepared to go downstairs again. In the attics, as in the other parts of the house I had as yet explored, I closed the doors, when there were keys locking them, when there were not, trying them, and in all cases leaving them securely fastened. When I reached the ground floor, the evening was drawing on apace, and I felt that if I wanted to explore the whole house before dusk, I must hurry my proceedings. I'll take the kitchens next, I decided, and so made my way out to a wilderness of domestic offices lying to the rear of the great hall. Stone passages, great kitchens, an immense servants' hall, larders, pantries, coal cellars, beer cellars, laundries, brew houses, housekeeper's room. It was not of any use lingering over these details. The mystery that troubled Mr. Garrison could scarcely lodge amongst cinders and empty bottles, and there did not seem much else left in this part of the building. I would go through the living room and then decide as to the apartments I should occupy myself. The evening shadows were drawing on apace, so I hurried back into the hall, feeling it was a weird position to be in there all alone with those ghostly, hollow figures of men in armour, and the statues on which the moon's beams must fall so coldly. I would just look through the lower apartments and then kindle a fire. I had seen quantities of wood in a cupboard close at hand, and felt that beside a blazing hearth, and after a good cup of tea, I should not feel the solitary sensation which was oppressing me. The sun had sunk below the horizon by this time, for to reach Ludlow I had been obliged to travel by cross lines of railway, and wait besides for such trains as condescended to carry third-class passengers. But there was still enough light in the hall to see all objects distinctly. With my own eyes, I saw that one of the doors I had shut with my own hands was standing wide. I turned to the door on the other side of the hall. It was, as I had left it, closed. This, then, was the room, this with the open door. For a second I stood appalled. I think I was fairly frightened. That did not last long, however. There lay the work I had desired to undertake, the foe I had offered to fight. So, without more ado, I shut the door and tried it. Now I will walk to the end of the hall and see what happens, I considered. I did so. I walked to the foot of the grand staircase and back again and looked. The door stood wide open. I went into the room. After just a spasm of irresolution, went in and pulled up the blinds. A good-sized room, 20 by 20, I know, because I paced it afterwards, lighted by 2 long windows. The floor of polished oak was partially covered with a Turkey carpet. There were 2 recesses beside the fireplace, one fitted up as a bookcase, the other with an old and elaborately caned cabinet. I was astonished also to find a bedstead in an apartment so little retired from the traffic of the house. And there were also some chairs of an obsolete make, covered so far as I could make out with faded tapestry. Beside the bedstead, which stood against the wall opposite to the door, I perceived another door. It was fast locked, the only locked door I had as yet met with in the interior of the house. It was a dreary, gloomy room, the dark-panelled walls, the black, shining floor, the windows, high up from the ground, the antique furniture, the dull 4-poster bedstead with dingy velvet curtains, the gaping chimney, the silk counterpane that looked like a pall. Any crime might have been committed in such a room, I thought pettishly, and then I looked at the door critically. Someone had been at the trouble of fitting bolts upon it, for when I passed out, I had not merely shut the door securely, but bolted it as well. "I'll go and get some wood, and then look at it again," I soliloquized. When I came back, it stood open once more. "Stay open, then," I cried in a fury. "I won't trouble myself any more with you tonight." Almost as I spoke the words, there came a ring at the front door. Echoing through the desolate house, the peal in the then state of my nerves startled me beyond expression. It was only the man who had agreed to bring over my traps. I bade him lay them down in the hall, and while looking out some small silver, asked where the nearest post office was to be found. "Not far from the park gates," he said. "If I wanted any letter sent," he said, "he would drop it in the box for me. The mail cart picked up the bag at 10 o'clock. I had nothing ready to post then, and told him so. Perhaps the money I gave was more than he expected, or perhaps the dreariness of my position impressed him as it had impressed me, for he paused with his hand on the lock and asked, "Are you going to stop here all alone, master?" "All alone," I answered with such cheerfulness as was possible under the circumstances. "That's a room, you know," he said, nodding in the direction of the open door and dropping his voice to a whisper. "Yes, I know," I replied. "What, you've been trying to shut it already, have you? Well, you're a game one." And with this complimentary, if not very respectful comment, he hastened out of the house. Evidently, he had no intention of proffering his services towards the solution of the mystery. I cast one glance at the door. It stood wide open. Through the windows I had left bare to the night, moonlight was beginning to stream cold and silvery. Before I did aught else, I felt I must write to Mr. Garrison and Patty, so straightforward I hurried to one of the great tables in the hall, and lighting a candle my thoughtful link girl had provided with many other things, sat down and dashed off the 2 epistles. Then, down the long avenue with its mysterious lights and shades, with the moonbeams glinting here and there, playing at hide-and-seek round the boles of the trees, and through the tracery of the quivering leaf and stem, I walked as fast as if I were doing a march against time. It was delicious, the scent of the summer odours, the smell of the earth. If it had not been for the door, I should have felt too happy. As it was, "Look here, Phil," I said all of a sudden, "life's not child play, as Uncle truly remarks. The door is just the trouble you have now to face, and you must face it. But for that door, you would never have been here. I hope you're not going to turn coward the very first night. Courage, that is your enemy. Conquer it." "I will try," my other self answered back. "I can but try. I can but fail." The post office was at Ladlow Hollow, a little hamlet through which the stream I had remarked dawdling on its way across the park flowed swiftly, spanned by an ancient bridge. As I stood by the door of the little shop asking some questions of the postmistress, the same gentleman I had met in the afternoon mounted on his roan horse passed on foot. He wished me good night as he went by, and nodded familiarly to my companion, who curtsied her acknowledgments. "His lordship ages fast," she remarked, following the retreating figure with her eyes. "His lordship," I repeated. "Of whom are you speaking?" "Of Lord Ladlow," she said. "Oh, I've never seen him," I answered, puzzled. "Why, that was Lord Ladlow," she exclaimed. You may be sure I had something to think about as I walked back to the hall, something beside the moonlight and the sweet night scents and the rustle of beast and bird and leaf that makes silence seem more eloquent than noise way down in the heart of the country. Lord Ladlow, my word! I thought he was hundreds, thousands of miles away, and here I found him, he walking in the opposite direction from his own home, I an inmate of his desolate abode. What was that? I heard a noise in a shrubbery close at hand, and in an instant I was in the thick of the underwood. Something shot out and darted into cover of the further plantation. I followed, but I could never catch a glimpse of it. I didn't know the lie of the ground sufficiently to course with success, and I had at length to give up my hunt, heated, baffled, and annoyed. When I got into the house, the moon's beams were streaming down on the hall. I could see every statue, every square of marble, every piece of armour. For all the world, it seemed to me like something in a dream. But I was tired and sleepy, and decided I would not trouble about fire or food, or the open door, till the morning. I would go to sleep. With this intention, I picked up some of my traps and carried them to a room on the first floor I had selected as small and habitable. I went down for the rest, and this time chanced to lay my hand on my rifle. It was wet. I touched the floor. It was wet likewise. I never felt anything like the thrill of delight which shot through me. I had to deal with flesh and blood, and I would deal with it, heaven helping me. The next morning broke clear and bright. I was up with the lark, had washed, dressed, breakfasted, explored the house before the postman came with my letters. One from Mr. Garrison, one from Patty, and one from my uncle. I gave the man £50. I was so delighted, and said I was afraid my being at the hall would cause him some additional trouble. "No, sir," he answered, profuse in his expressions of gratitude. "I pass here every morning on my way to her ladyship's." "Who is her ladyship?" I asked. "The Dowager Lady Ladlow," he answered, "the old lord's widow." "And where's her place?" I persisted. "If you keep on through the shrubbery and across the waterfall, you come to a house about 1/4 mile further up the stream." He departed after telling me there was only one post a day, and I hurried back to the room in which I had breakfasted, carrying my letters with me. I opened Mr. Garrison's first. The gist of it was, "Spare no expense. If you run short of money, telegraph for it." I opened my uncle's next. He implored me to return. He had always thought me harebrained, but felt a deep interest in and affection for me, and thought he could get me a good berth if I would only try to settle down and promise to stick to my work. The last was from Patty. Oh, Patty, God bless you. Such women, I fancy, the men who fight best in battle, who stick last to a sinking ship, who are firm in life's struggle, who are brave to resist temptation, must have known and loved. I can't tell you more about the letter except that it gave me strength to go on to the end. I spent the forenoon considering that door. I looked at it from within and from without. I eyed it critically. I tried whether there was any reason why it should fly open, and found that as long as I remained on the threshold, it remained closed. If I walked even so far away as the opposite side of the hall, it swung wide. Do what I could, it burst from latch and bolt. I could not lock it because there was no key. Well before 2 o'clock, I confess I was baffled. At 2 there came a visitor, none other than Lord Ladlow himself. Sorely I wanted to take his horse round to the stables, but he would not hear of it. Walk beside me across the park, if you'll be so kind, he said. I want to speak to you. We went together across the park, and before we parted I felt I could have gone through fire and water for this simple-spoken nobleman. You must not stay here ignorant of the rumours which are afloat, he said. Of course, when I let the place to Mr. Carrison, I knew nothing of the open door. Did you not, sir, my lord, I mean? I stammered. He smiled. Do not trouble yourself about my title, which indeed carries a very empty state with it, but talk to me as you might a friend. I had no idea there was any ghost story connected with the hall, or I should have kept the place empty. I did not know exactly what to answer, so I remained silent. How did you chance to be sent here? He asked, after a pause. I told him, when the first shock was over, a lord did not seem very different from anybody else. If an emperor had taken a morning canter across the park, I might, supposing him equally affable, have spoken as familiarly to him as to Lord Ladlow. My mother always said I entirely lacked the bump of veneration. Beginning at the beginning, I repeated the whole story, from Parton's remark about the sovereign to Mr. Carrison's conversation with my uncle. When I had left London behind in the narrative, however, and arrived at the hall, I became somewhat more reticent. After all, it was his hall. People could not live in, his door that would not keep shut, and it seemed to me these mere facts he might dislike being forced upon his attention. But he would have it. What had I seen? What did I think of the matter? Very honestly, I told him I didn't know what to say. The door certainly wouldn't remain shut. There seemed to me no human agency to account for its persistent opening. But then, on the other hand, ghosts generally did not tamper with firearms, and my rifle, though not loaded, had been tampered with. I was sure of that. My companion listened attentively. "You're not frightened, are you?" he inquired at length. "Not now," I answered. "The door did give me a start last evening, but I'm not afraid of that since I find someone is afraid of a bullet." He did not answer for a minute, then said, "The theory people have set about the open door is this. As in that room my uncle was murdered, they say the door will never remain shut till the murderer is discovered." Murdered? I did not like the word at all. It made me feel chill and uncomfortable. Yes, he was murdered sitting in his chair, and the assassin has never been discovered. At first, persons inclined to the belief that I killed him indeed. Many of them are of that opinion still. But you did not, sir. There is not a word of truth in that story, is there? He laid his hand on my shoulder as he said, "No, my lad, not a word. I loved the old man tenderly, even when he disinherited me for the sake of his young wife. I was sorry, but not angry. And when he sent for me and assured me that he'd resolved to repair that wrong, I tried to induce him to leave the lady a handsome sum in addition to her jointure. If you do not, people may think she has not been the source of the happiness you expected," I added. "Thank you, Hal," he said. "You're a good fellow. We'll talk further about this tomorrow." And he bade me good night. Before morning broke, it was the summer 2 years ago, the household was aroused by a fearful scream. It was his death cry. He had been stabbed from behind in the neck. He was seated in his chair writing a letter to me, but for that I might have found it harder to clear myself than was the case, for his solicitors came forward and said he had signed a will, leaving all his personalty to me. He was very rich, unconditionally, only 3 days previously. That, of course, supplied the motive, as my lady's lawyer put it. She was very vindictive, spared no expense in trying to prove my guilt, and said openly she would never rest till she saw justice done, if it cost her the whole of her fortune. The letter lying before the dead man, over which his blood had spurted, she declared must have been placed on this table by me, but the coroner saw that there was an animus in this, for the few opening lines stated my uncle's desire to confide in me his reasons for changing his will. Reasons, he said, that involved his honour, as they had destroyed his peace. In the statement you'll find sealed up with my will in, at that point, he was dealt his death blow. The papers were never found, and the will was never proved. My lady put in the former will, leaving her everything. Ill as I could afford to go to law, I was obliged to dispute the matter, and the lawyers are at it still, and very likely will continue at it for years. When I lost my good name, I lost my good health, and had to go abroad. And while I was away, Mr. Carrison took the hall. Till I returned, I never heard a word about the open door. My solicitor said Mr. Carrison was behaving badly, but I think now I must see them or him and consider what can be done in this affair. As for yourself, it is of vital importance to me that this mystery should be cleared up, and if you are really not timid, stay on. I'm too poor to make rash promises, but you won't find me ungrateful." "Oh, my lord," I cried. The address slipped quite easily and naturally off my tongue. "I don't want any more money or anything. If I can only show Patty's father I'm good for something." "Who is Patty?" he asked. He read the answer in my face, for he said no more. "Should you like to have a good dog for company?" he inquired after a pause. I hesitated, then I said, "No, thank you. I'd rather watch and hunt for myself." And as I spoke, the remembrance of that something in the shrubbery recurred to me, and I told him I thought there had been someone about the place the previous evening. "Poachers," he suggested, but I shook my head. "A girl or a woman, I imagine. However, I think a dog might hamper me." He went away, and I returned to the house. I never left it all day. I did not go into the garden or the stable yard or the shrubbery or anywhere. I devoted myself solely and exclusively to that door. If I shut it once, I shut it 100 times, and always with the same result. Do what I could, it swung wide. Never, however, when I was looking at it. So long as I could endure to remain, it stayed shut. The instant I turned my back, it stood open. About 4 o'clock, I had another visitor, no other than Lord Ludlow's daughter, the Honourable Beatrice, riding her funny little white pony. She was a beautiful girl of 15 or thereabouts, and she had the sweetest smile you ever saw. "Papa sent me with this," she said. "He would not trust any other messenger," and she put a piece of paper in my hand. "Keep your food under lock and key, buy what you require yourself, get your water from the pump in the stable yard. I'm going from home, but if you want anything, go or send to my daughter." "Any answer?" she asked, patting her pony's neck. "Tell his lordship, if you please, I will keep my powder dry," I replied. "You have made Papa look so happy," she said, still patting that fortunate pony. "If it is in my power, I will make him look happier still, miss," and I hesitated, not knowing how to address her. "Call me Beatrice," she said with enchanting grace, then added slyly, "Papa promises me I shall be introduced to Patty ere long." And before I could recover from my astonishment, she had tightened the bit and was turning across the park. "One moment, please," I cried. "You can do something for me." "What is it?" And she came back, trotting over the great sweep in the front of the house. "Lend me your pony for a minute." She was off before I could even offer to help her alight, off and gathering up her habit dexterously with one hand, led the docile old sheep forward with the other. I took the bridle. When I was with horses, I felt amongst my own kind, stroked the pony, pulled his ears, and let him thrust his nose into my hand. Miss Beatrice is a countess now, and a happy wife and mother, but I sometimes see her, and the other night she took me carefully into a conservatory and added, "Do you remember Toddy, Mr. Edlid?" "Remember him?" I exclaimed. "I can never forget him." "He is dead," she told me, and there were tears in her beautiful eyes as she spoke the words. "Mr. Edlid, I loved Toddy." Well, I took Toddy up to the house, and under the third window to the right hand. He was a docile creature, and let me stand on the saddle while I looked into the only room in Ludlow Hall I had been unable to enter. It was perfectly bare of furniture. There was not a thing in it, not a chair or table, not a picture on the walls or ornament on the chimney-piece. "That is where my granduncle's valet slept," said Miss Beatrice. "It was he who first ran in to help him the night he was murdered." "Where is the valet?" I asked. "Dead," she answered. "The shock killed him. He loved his master more than he loved himself." I had seen all I wished, so I jumped off the saddle, which I had carefully dusted with a branch plucked from a lilac tree. Between jest and earnest, pressed the hem of Miss Beatrice's habit to my lips as I arranged its folds, saw her wave a hand as she went at hand gallop across the park, and then turned back once again into the lonely house, with a determination to solve the mystery attached to it, or die in the attempt. Why, I cannot explain, but before I went to bed that night, I drove a gimlet I found in the stables hard into the floor, and said to the door, "Now I'm keeping you open." When I went down in the morning, the door was close shut, and the handle of the gimlet broken off, lying in the hall. I put my hand to wipe my forehead. It was dripping with perspiration. I did not know what to make of the place at all. I went out into the open air for a few minutes. When I returned, the door again stood wide. If I were to pursue in detail the days and nights that followed, I should weary my readers. I can only say they changed my life. The solitude, the solemnity, the mystery produced an effect I do not profess to understand, but that I cannot regret. I have hesitated about writing of the end, but it must come, so let me hasten to it. Though feeling convinced that no human agency did or could keep the door open, I was certain that some living person had means of access to the house that I could not discover. This was made apparent in trifles which might have escaped unnoticed that several or even two people occupied the mansion, but that in my solitary position it was impossible to overlook. A chair would be misplaced, for instance. A path would be visible over a dusty floor. My papers, I found, were moved, my clothes touched. Letters I carried about with me and kept under my pillow at night. Still, the fact remained that when I went to the post office, or while I was asleep, someone did wander over the house. On Lord Ludlow's return, I meant to ask him for some further particulars of his uncle's death, and I was about to write to Mr. Carrison and beg permission to have the door where the valet had slept broken open, when one morning, very early indeed, I spied a hairpin lying close to it. What an idiot I had been. If I wanted to solve the mystery of the open door, of course I must keep watch in the room itself. The door would not stay wide open unless there was a reason for it, and most certainly a hairpin could not have got into the house without assistance. I made up my mind what I should do, that I would go to the post early and take up my position about the door. I had hitherto started for Ludlow Hollow. I felt on the eve of a discovery, and longed for the day to pass, that the night might come. It was a lovely morning. The weather had been exquisite during the whole week, and I flung the hall door wide to let in the sunshine and the breeze. As I did so, I saw there was a basket on the top step, a basket filled with rare and beautiful fruit and flowers. Mr. Carrison had let off the gardens attached to Ludlow Hall for the season. He thought he might as well save something out of that fire, he said, so my fare had not been very varied with the delicacies of that kind. I was very fond of fruit in those days, and seeing a card addressed to me, I instantly selected a tempting peach and ate it, a little greedily perhaps. I might say I had barely swallowed the last morsel when Lord Ludlow's caution recurred to me. The fruit had a curious flavour. There was a strange taste hanging around my palate. For a moment, sky, trees and park swam before my eyes. Then I made my mind up what to do. I smelt the fruit. It had all the same faint odour. Then I put some in my pocket, took the basket and locked it away, walked around to the farmyard, asked for the loan of a horse that was generally driven in a light cart, and in less than half an hour was asking in Ludlow to be directed to a doctor. Rather cross at being disturbed so early, he was first inclined to pooh-pooh my idea, but I made him cut open the pear and satisfy himself that the fruit had been tampered with. "It's fortunate you stopped at the first peach," he remarked, after giving me a draught and some medicine to take back, and advising me to keep in the open air as much as possible. "I should like to retain this fruit and see you again tomorrow." We did not think then on how many morrows we should see each other. Riding across to Ludlow, the postman had given me 3 letters, but I did not read them till I was seated under a great tree in the park, with a basin of milk and a piece of bread beside me. Hitherto, there had been nothing exciting in my correspondence. Patty's epistles were always delightful, but they could not be regarded as sensational, and about Mr. Carrison there was a monotony I had begun to find tedious. On this occasion, however, no fault could be found on that score. The contents of his letter greatly surprised me. He said Lord Ludlow had released him from his bargain, that I could therefore leave the Hall at once. He enclosed me £10, said he would consider how he could best advance my interests, and that I had better call upon him at his private house when I returned to London. I do not think I shall leave Ludlow yet a while, I considered as I replaced his letter in its envelope. Before I go, I should like to make it hot for whoever sent me that fruit, so unless Lord Ludlow turns me out, I'll stay a little longer. Lord Ludlow did not wish me to leave. The 3rd letter was from him. "I shall return home tomorrow night," he wrote, "and see you on Wednesday. I have arranged satisfactorily with Mr. Carrison, and as the hall is my own again, I mean to try to solve the mystery it contains myself. If you choose to stop and help me do so, you would confer a favour, and I will try to make it worth your while. I will keep watch tonight. and see if I can't give you some news tomorrow, I thought. And then I opened Patty's letter, the best, dearest, sweetest letter any postman in all the world could have brought me. If it had not been for what Lord Ludlow said about his sharing my undertaking, I should not have chosen that night for my vigil. I felt ill and languid, fancy no doubt, to a great degree inducing these sensations. I had lost energy in a most unaccountable manner. The long, lonely days had told upon my spirits. The fidgety feeling which took me 100 times in the 12 hours to look upon the open door, to close it, and to count how many steps I could take before it opened again, had tried my mental strength as a perpetual blister might have worn away my physical. No sense was I fit for the task I had set myself, and yet I determined to go through with it. Why had I never before decided to watch in that mysterious chamber? Had I been at the bottom of my heart afraid? In the bravest of us there are depths of cowardice that lurk unsuspected till they engulf our courage. The day wore on, the long, dreary day. Evening approached, the night shadows closed over the hall. The moon would not rise for a couple of hours more. Everything was still as death. The house had never before seemed to me so silent and so deserted. I took a light and went up to my accustomed room, moving about for a time as though preparing for bed. Then I extinguished the candle, softly opened the door, turned the key and put it in my pocket, slipped softly downstairs, across the hall, through the open door. Then I knew I had been afraid, for I felt a thrill of terror as in the dark I stepped over the threshold. I paused and listened. There was not a sound. The night was still and sultry as though a storm were brewing. Not a leaf seemed moving. The very mice remained in their holes. Noiselessly, I made my way to the other side of the room. There was an old-fashioned easy chair between the bookshelves and the bed. I sat down on it, shrouded by the heavy curtain. The hours passed. Were ever hours so long? The moon rose, came and looked in at the windows, and then sailed away to the west, but not a sound. No, not even the cry of a bird. I seemed to myself a mere collection of nerves. Every part of my body appeared twitching. It was agony to remain still. The desire to move became a form of torture. Ah, streak in the sky, morning at last, heaven be praised. Had ever anyone before so welcomed a dawn? A thrush began to sing. Was there ever heard such delightful music? It was the morning twilight. Soon the sun would rise, soon that awful vigil would be over, and yet I was no nearer the mystery than before. Hush, what was that? It had come. After the hours of watching and waiting, after the long night and the long suspense, it came in a moment. The locked door opened so suddenly, so silently, that I had barely time to draw back behind the curtain before I saw a woman in the room. She went straight across to the other door and closed it, securing it, as I saw, with bolt and lock. Then, just glancing around, she made her way into the cabinet, and with a key she shot back the wards. I didn't stir. I scarcely breathed, and yet she seemed uneasy. Whatever she wanted to do, she evidently was in haste to finish, for she took out the drawers one by one and placed them on the floor. Then, as the light grew better, I saw her first kneel on the floor and peer into every aperture, and subsequently repeat the same process. Standing on a chair, she drew forward for the purpose a slight, lithe woman, not a lady, clad all in black, not a bit of white about her. What on earth could she want? In a moment it flashed upon me, the will and the letter. She's searching for them. I sprang for my concealment. I had her in my grasp, but she tore herself out of my hands, fighting like a wildcat. She hit, scratched, kicked, shifting her body as though she had not a bone in it, and at last slipped herself free and ran wildly towards the door by which she had entered. If she reached it, she would escape me. I rushed across the room and just caught her dress as she was on the threshold. My blood was up, and I dragged her back. She had the strength of 20 devils, I think, and struggled as surely no woman did before. "I do not want to kill you," I managed to say and gasped, "but I will if you do not keep quiet." "Bah!" she cried. Before I knew what she was doing, she had the revolver out of my pocket and fired. She missed. The ball just glanced off my sleeve. I fell upon her. I can use no other expression, for it had become a fight for life, and no man can tell the ferocity there is in him till he is placed as I was then. Fell upon her and seized the weapon. She would not let it go, but I held her so tight she could not use it. She bit my face with her disengaged hand. She tore my hair. She turned and twisted and slipped about like a snake, but I didn't feel pain or anything except a deadly horror lest my strength should give out. Could I hold out much longer? She made one desperate plunge. I felt the grasp with which I held her slacking. She felt it too, and seizing her advantage, tore herself free, and at the same instant fired again blindly and again missed. Suddenly, there came a look of horror into her eyes, a frozen expression of fear. "See," she cried, and flinging the revolver at me, fled. I saw, as in a momentary flash, that the door I had beheld locked stood wide, that there stood beside the table an awful figure with uplifted hand, and then I struck no more. I was struck at last. As she threw the revolver at me, she must have pulled the trigger, for I felt something like red-hot iron enter my shoulder, and I could but rush from the room till I fell senseless on the marble pavement of the hall. When the postman came that morning, finding no one stirring, he looked through one of the long windows that flanked the door, then he ran to the farmyard and called for help. "There's something wrong inside," he cried. "That young gentleman is lying on the floor in a pile of blood." As they rushed round to the front of the house, they saw Lord Ladlow riding up the avenue and breathlessly told him what had happened. "Smash in one of the windows," he said, "and go instantly for a doctor." They laid me on the bed in that terrible room, and I telegraphed for my father. For long I hovered between life and death, but at length I recovered sufficiently to be removed to the house Lord Ladlow owned on the other side of the hollow. Before that time, I had told him all I knew and begged him to make instant search for the will. "Break up the cabinet if necessary," I entreated. "I'm sure the papers are there." And they were. The lordship got his own, and as to the scandal and the crime, one was hushed up and the other remained unpunished. The dowager and the maid went abroad the very morning I lay on the marble pavement at Ladlow Hall. They never returned. My lord made that one condition of his silence. Not in Meadowshire, but in a fairer county still, I have a farm which I manage, and make both ends meet comfortably. Patty is the best wife any man ever possessed, and well, I'm just as happy, if a trifle more serious than of old, but there are times when a great horror of darkness seems to fall upon me, and at such periods I cannot endure to be left alone. By the way, if you're still awake, do me a favour and just press the like button for this video. Or even better, do both that and press subscribe. This lets YouTube know that I'm doing things that people like, and then YouTube gives me a bit of a boost.